I will introduce myself, and so we can get close to Armenian time. I figure if we're 20 minutes late, we'll be right on Armenian time. My name is Larry Fuchs, Laurence Fuchs, and I'm a professor at Brandeis University. And my interest as an adult, as a scholar, from the very first, has been the question, how does this society manage ethnicity? How do we build a more decent, multi-ethnic society? And most of my work has been involved in that. And I have been, in recent years, particularly interested in immigration policy and history, and returned from Washington a few years ago after serving as the executive director of the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, whose recommendations form the basis for the current immigration legislation about to be debated in the House of Representatives and having already passed the United States Senate. Now, I know a little bit about Armenian time. It's not so unusual. And if we have some people walking in, it'll be okay. When I was a young boy growing up in the Bronx, in my ethnocentric way, I was under the illusion that it was only the Jews who were not on Anglo-Saxon time. Then at my high school, and so they spoke of Jewish time, which I think ran about a half hour late to most functions. And then I met friends, black friends from Harlem, and they took me down to Harlem, and I learned about CPT, colored people's time. And that would run about an hour and a half late for most events. And then the second book that I wrote was a book about Hawaii, ethnic history and ethnic politics in Hawaii. In Hawaii, I learned about Hawaiian time, and it meant pretty much if somebody said, I'll see you sometime in an hour or so, it could be any time in the course of that day. And then I went to the Philippines, where I was the director of the Peace Corps, and I learned about Filipino time. And if somebody said, I see you on Tuesday, it could be any Tuesday in the next several months. So it finally hit me that the only people who had a punctuality fetish were the Anglo-Saxons, and that they were a very small minority of the world's population. Well, despite Armenian time, the Armenians are what we call in the minority biz an achieving minority. Like some of the other achieving minorities, the fetish on punctuality does not seem to be a critical or decisive factor in leading toward a high achievement. Today we're going to have 4 presenters, each one of whom will be given 25 minutes. I will enforce the rule, really 30 minutes, but we're going to warn them at 25 minutes, and they really have to close at 30 and must not take any more. And I will enforce it just as if we were all Anglo-Saxons, all heavily acculturated and ready to go with this society and adjust to its absurd ways. At the end of the 4 presentations, I will open the period for discussion from the audience and questions. Questions and discussions, please, not speeches. That's another thing that we all do pretty well, and we want to have as few speeches from the floor as possible and have the speeches made here up at the table. I will introduce that discussion period with a few remarks of my own, I hope to develop some of the highlights and some of the points at issue in tension. Now, our very first speaker is going to be Gregory Aftandilian of the Library of Congress, who is an expert on Middle East research. He's an analyst there. He received his MA in International Relations from the London School of Economics, and an MS and an MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Chicago. He is a Dartmouth man too. We will not hold that too much against him. It could be worse. His major publication is Armenia, A Vision of a Republic, The Independence Lobby in America, 1918-1927, which was published 3 years ago. The tenacity of ethnicity in the United States, of course, is fed by the relations which ethnic Americans have with other countries or other peoples aspiring to be countries. And in no case is that more true than in the case of the Armenians. So, would you please tell us more about it, Gregory, and we'll listen for 25 minutes, then you will be rudely interrupted and you'll finish within another 5 minutes. That's yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Fuchs. The lobby group I'm going to be talking about lasted from 1918 to 1927, but in interests of the 30-minute rule, I'm going to concentrate on the two most important years of the lobby, 1918 to 1920, at which time there were plans for U.S. assistance for Armenia. Armenian Americans were plunged into the American foreign policy arena during and immediately after World War I as catastrophic events in their homeland and American plans for their people's resurrection brought forth a committed and activistic stance among them. Yet the community was ill-suited and ill-prepared for this task of lobbying the United States government. Lacking numbers, financial resources, cohesiveness, and experience vis-a-vis the American political system, the Armenian American community looked to ways to overcome these shortcomings. One response, devised by an Armenian American attorney named Kouymjian, was to create a lobby of influential non-Armenians and to direct them to enunciate and lobby for the claims of the Armenians. This lobby, the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia, became the most articulate and powerful Armenophile organization in the United States. However, despite its influence, the lobby failed in its primary mission of ensuring American support for Armenian statehood. In this paper, I will first examine the ACIA's relationship with the Armenian American community, and then explore the ACIA's efforts to lobby the United States government. In order to understand the objectives of the Armenian American community at the time it entered the American political debate on Armenia, one must first examine the event which played a major role in shaping its political orientation, the Armenian genocide. The genocide of the Armenians during World War I at the hands of the Young Turk regime not only had a profound psychological impact on the Armenian diaspora, but an ideological one as well. Prior to the genocide, few Armenians contemplated independence from the Turks. Rather, Armenians, even committed revolutionaries, favored the reform of the Ottoman Empire or an autonomous Armenia within a federated Ottoman state. Indeed, the largest Armenian nationalist party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, ARF or Dashtagsyutun, allied itself with the Young Turks in the revolution of 1908 to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid and create a liberal Ottoman state. This strategy mainly resulted from the belief that complete independence was impracticable. But what also entered into their thinking was the belief that once liberalism took root in the Ottoman Empire, the Turks would learn to tolerate Armenian rights. Intellectuals in particular believed that the Turks and the Armenians might learn to live in peace. These optimistic beliefs were shattered by the cataclysmic events of World War I. The Young Turks became increasingly chauvinistic and adopted the ideology of pan-Turkism, the linkage of Turks in Anatolia to their ethnic brethren living in the Russian Empire. The Armenians were to have no place in this new state. A short while after they entered the war, the Young Turks put into motion their plan to finally settle the Armenian question. By outright massacre and deportation to the Syrian desert, the Young Turks succeeded in exterminating 1 to 1.5 million Armenians, about 1/3 of the worldwide Armenian population. The genocide convinced the Armenians of diaspora, most of whom had lost family members in the carnage, that only by complete independence would Armenians ever be able to live and prosper in their ancestral homelands. Never again would they live under Turkish rule. The surviving intellectual elite felt both shame and betrayal for having trusted the Turks in the period of 1908 to 1914. Support for independence was enhanced by the creation in May 1918 of a small Armenian republic on a section of Russian Armenian lands. Many Armenians looked to that state as a core from which a larger state, encompassing the Turkish Armenian provinces, would be created. Armenians the world over waited anxiously for the day when the war would be over and the Armenian case favorably settled by the post-war peace conference. Armenian hopes were raised by the pledges of Allied statesmen during the war. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and French President Georges Clemenceau stated that Armenia would be entitled to, quote, for a separate national condition, and that Armenia's fate would be settled according to the supreme laws of justice and humanity. Thousands of diaspora Armenians, particularly in France and the United States, joined the armies of the Allies after the massacres had begun to both assist in the fight against the Turks and to ensure Allied support for Armenia. In addition, tens of thousands of Russian Armenians fought throughout the war and played a crucial role in delaying Turkish troops from reaching the oil fields of Baku in 1918. As a result of these efforts, Armenia was referred to as the Little Ally. But the Little Ally soon discovered that Allied pledges were quite different from Allied plans. Secret Allied treaties released by the Bolsheviks after they seized power in Russia reveal that the Allies planned a division of historical Armenian territories among themselves. The London Agreement of 1915 and the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 gave to France Silesian Armenia and parts of the provinces of Kharpet, Sivas, and Diyarbakir, and Russia was given the rest of the Turkish Armenian provinces. Russia planned to repopulate these lands with Russian colonists, not with Armenian refugees. Although these treaties, insofar as the Armenians were concerned, became largely inapplicable because of the demise of Tsarist Russia, they nevertheless disturbed Armenian nationalists who became skeptical of proposed Allied assistance for independent Armenia. By contrast, the United States government's stance is much more reassuring to Armenian nationalists. In December 1917, the U.S. inquiry, a group of experts who drew up recommendations to serve as a basis for the President Wilson's 14 points, advocated that Armenia be placed under a League of Nations mandatory power with territories extending from Silesia on the Mediterranean coast to Russian Armenia. On the question of self-determination, the inquiry stated, unquote, the principle of majority should not apply in this case because of the conditions under which the Armenian people have lived in the past. They have suffered from every handicap of nature and man. They have been massacred and deported by the hundreds of thousands. They have been subject of international political intrigue, and at this moment, helpless and weak as they are being passed for the unfavorable settlement of their affairs by big powers seeking to define spheres of future political and commercial interests. It would be a departure from the principle of fair dealing if at this time every claim were not heard with patience and their new state established under conditions that would in some manner right historical wrongs. The pro-Armenian stance of the U.S. government was largely a result of widespread American public sympathy for the Armenians and long years of American missionary work in Armenia. Under the direction of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, a wide network of schools, churches, hospitals, and other institutions were created throughout the Turkish Armenian provinces. By World War I, American missionary property in the Ottoman Empire was worth about $123 million, and the Armenian station became second in importance only to China. During the genocide of 1915, American missionaries reported these horrifying events to American Ambassador Henry Morgenthau and to their connections in the United States. Soon the American press began to publicize these atrocities, which resulted in a tremendous groundswell of support for the Armenians. In the fall of 1915, the American Board for Foreign Missions created the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief, which organized massive fund drives to aid the stricken refugees. The ACASR, the initials of this group, became incorporated as Near East Relief and raised $30 million from 1915 to 1919. Leading American political figures such as Charles Evans Hughes and William Howard Taft spoke at fundraising meetings, and President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed 2 days in 1916 as Near East Relief Days and encouraged all Americans to contribute to the relief fund. Although widespread American support for Armenians was evident, there was disagreement on the future plans for Armenia. Some leading American missionaries and relief administrators, such as James Barton, favored Armenian independence, while others, such as Caleb Gates and Ernest Riggs, believed that independence was impracticable and favored an American mandate for the whole of Anatolia. Even such staunchly pro-Armenian figures as Henry Morgenthau believed that Armenia should be connected to the Turkish part of Anatolia so as to create a viable state and to enable the United States to reform the Turks. In the autumn of 1918, a report entitled Recommendations for the Political Reconstruction of the Turkish Empire by William H. Hall, professor of the American University of Beirut, and Harold A. Hatch, an officer of the Armenian Relief Committee, advocated the preservation of the territorial integrity of the Turkish Empire. Within the Wilson administration, there was also divergencies of views. On his way to Paris, Henry White of the U.S. Peace Mission wrote Kardashian, quote, "It is impossible for me to say whether Armenian independence will be attained or not at the approaching conference." These statements and reports were alarming to the Armenians, who remained adamant about the issue of independence. In 1917, after the initial shock and trauma of learning about the genocide, the Armenian American community formed their first lobby group. Various Armenian American political, cultural, and religious organizations temporarily put aside their differences and created the Armenian National Union of America, ANUA. The aim of the ANUA was threefold: to further the cause of Armenian emancipation by sending volunteers to help fight the Turks, to collect funds for the rebuilding of Armenia, and to enlist diplomatic support for Armenian independence. To disseminate the Armenian cause, the ANUA published an English-language journal, the Armenian Herald, which included articles on the needs and aspirations of the Armenians and on Armenian culture. Several articles indicate that the community was very much concerned with the Armenian image, attempting to show that the Armenian was not always a refugee begging for food, but rather an intelligent, industrious individual who was capable of self-government. On the political side, the ANUA lobbied for the United States to declare war on Turkey. Missionaries and relief administrators, however, quietly campaigned against such a declaration because they believed it would have put an end to their relief work and subject missionary property to destruction or expropriation. Cleveland Dodge, a friend of Wilson's and a Near East philanthropist, was instrumental in convincing the president that American lives would be in jeopardy if the United States declared war on Turkey. Wilson apparently agreed and did not ask Congress for such action. The Armenians were greatly distressed, for they believed that it would have hastened Turkey's downfall and made the United States take a leading role in the dismemberment of the empire. One of the most vocal proponents of a war declaration against Turkey was an Armenian-American attorney named Vahan Kardashian, who took note of the fact that the ANUA failed miserably in its first major attempt to influence American foreign policy. Kardashian was soon to press for a change in tactics. Born in 1883 in Caesarea, Turkey, Kardashian had a fascinating career. He first attended French Jesuit and American missionary schools. In 1902, at the age of 19, he immigrated to New York, where he married a wealthy American widow named Cornelia A. Holub, a New York socialite. In 1904, an associate of his claims, Kardashian's wife was instrumental in his being accepted at Yale. He studied law at Yale from 1904 to 1908 and proved to be an outstanding student. While at Yale, he published a book, The Ottoman Empire of the 20th Century, and an article, A Brief Commentary on the Eastern Question, which was strongly anti-imperialist. These two works introduced him to those in America interested in the plight of the Armenians. He was admitted to the New York bar in 1909 and opened a law practice in New York City, which became quite lucrative. Kardashian and his wife were later divorced in 1916. In 1911, during the Armenian-Turkish alliance in the Ottoman Empire, Kardashian became the attorney for the Turkish embassy in Washington and for the Turkish consulate in New York. In this capacity, he met influential American politicians, many of whom he would later approach to help the cause of Armenian independence. In 1913, he was hired by the Chester Group, an American business firm which sought concessions in Turkey. The following year, became High Commissioner for the Turkish exhibition of the Panama Pacific Universal Exposition at San Francisco, where he met a host of dignitaries such as William Jennings Bryan, who later became an ardent supporter of Armenia. Although the evidence is fragmentary, it appears that even though Kardashian may have seemed pro-Turkish at this time, he secretly labored for the Armenian cause. In 1913, for instance, he met Theodore Roosevelt and wrote to former American ambassadors Andrew White, Joseph Choate, and Horace Carter, and to university presidents Hadley, Butler, and Elliott, that's Elliott of Harvard here, asking them to send supporting cables to the ambassadorial conference in London, which was considering reform measures in the Armenian provinces. Infuriated by the massacres and deportations of the Armenians during which his mother and sister perished, Kardashian wrote several letters about these tragic events to Bryan, who was so moved that he showed them to U.S. Secretary of State Lansing. In turn, Lansing showed parts of the letters to the German ambassador, who then told the Turkish ambassador to fire Kardashian. Immediately after this action, Kardashian went to the Turkish embassy in Washington and, it is alleged, threw his medals at the ambassador and swore at him in the vilest of language. From that time on, Kardashian became a vociferous Turkophobe and a ceaseless supporter of the Armenian cause. In the period from 1915 to 1918, an associate described him as a lone crusader because he went from city to city speaking to various American organizations and religious societies on behalf of the Armenians. Kouymjian's background, education, and political focus contrasted sharply against most Armenian Americans at that time. At the end of World War I, the Armenian American community, numbering not more than 100,000, was composed largely of factory laborers. The rest were mostly small shopkeepers or farmers. By and large, these immigrants had a poor command of the English language and little, if any, experience in dealing with the American political system. Although the community was highly politicized, its orientation was almost exclusively focused towards events in Armenia. Armenian political parties and newspapers had been established in the United States by party intellectuals and field workers, but no serious attempt was made to involve itself in American politics. Rather, the Armenian American community was seen primarily as a support group that would provide funds for the Armenian cause in Yerbid, or homeland. Thus, the community was ill-prepared to engage itself in American politics. Furthermore, the Armenian American community was rocked by internal dissension, which prevented it from presenting itself as a cohesive ethnic group. The unity that led to the formation of the ANUA in 1917 proved to be short-lived. By the summer of 1918, the ANUA began to fall apart, mainly over the question of the Armenian Republic, which is dominated by the ARF, or Dashnak Sütun, the largest Armenian political party. The Dashnak Sütun, or Dashnak Party, was a nationalist revolutionary party and advocated a socialist platform. Its main rival, the Ramgavar Party, was a liberal reformist party which drew much of its support from the bourgeoisie. A short while after the formation of the Armenian Republic, the Ramgavars and most other non-Dashnak parties in the United States condemned the Republic, arguing that the Dashnaks were acting out of political adventurism and that the future Armenian state should be in Turkish Armenia, not Russian Armenia. Many Ramgavars also felt that the Republic would allow the Allies an excuse to forego creating an independent Armenian state in Turkish Armenia, since they could claim the Armenians already had a state. Countering these charges, the Dashnaks contended that the Republic had been formed bravely under chaotic conditions, and the party owed its dominance there to its widespread popular support. Additionally, the Republic would soon be attached to Turkish Armenia once the impending peace conference settled the Armenian question. At this time, Kouymjian was not affiliated with any Armenian political party, but he became a supporter of Bogos Nubar Pasha, a wealthy and conservative Armenian from Egypt who represented Turkish Armenians in Paris under the aegis of the Armenian National Delegation. In political philosophy, Nubar was close to the Ramgavar party. In October 1918, Kouymjian wrote to the Nubar, complaining about ANUA leader Miran Sevasli. He or the National Union can no longer be trusted with responsible duties in the field of propaganda and diplomacy, charged Kouymjian. He also criticized Sevasli for supporting the Armenian Republic, referring to it as the so-called Republic of Ararat. November 1918, the ANUA asked Kouymjian to form an Armenian press bureau in New York. Seizing this opportunity, Kouymjian then took the press bureau under his personal direction and away from the ANUA. Although it officially carried the union's name in the beginning of 1919, for all practical purposes it operated on its own. Kouymjian also turned from a pro-Nubar to a pro-ARF stance, supporting the Armenian Republic. The ARF in turn supported the press bureau and thus ACIA activities with continual funds. Why Kouymjian changed his political views is unclear. One might speculate since the ANUA was nearly defunct at this time, he simply moved with the times. Perhaps the strong nationalist ideology of the ARF appealed to him at this stage, and he also may have been motivated by personal reasons, for he did not want to work with Sevasli. Having now a base of operations and financial support, Kouymjian put into motion his plan to create a more effective organization. He explained, quote, "It was at this time that I saw an Armenian body would be unable to push the Armenian case in the United States. I also saw that the propaganda effort must be effective and must be direct. This propaganda effort must be of such a nature as to influence the United States government. Therefore, in December 1918, I organized the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia." Kouymjian's plan was to create an organization of non-Armenians and to direct them to lobby for Armenian independence. The Armenian Press Bureau in New York would provide the staff and was the link between the Armenian American community and the ACIA. Yet, because of the divisions within the Armenian American community, the ACIA remained controversial because of Kouymjian's handling of Armenian affairs and his support for the Armenian Republic. Although all Armenians supported the concept of Armenian independence, the non-ARF segment of the community never fully accepted the Republic. Kouymjian never became an ARF member, but remained a firm supporter of the party. He frequently corresponded with ARF officials and tried to coordinate their policies through the ACIA. For example, reports from ARF diplomatic officials in Paris, such as Avadis Aharonian, were sometimes cabled to the Armenian Press Bureau, where Kouymjian and Girard would then act on them. Since the party lacked the experience and connections in dealing with the American establishment, it was often dependent on Kardashian for help in America. Kardashian's personal ideology had its impact on the ACIA. A strong nationalist and anti-imperialist, Kardashian favored either complete independence or an American mandate for Armenia alone. He distrusted the European powers such as Britain and France and the American missionary establishment as well. In a report he sent to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Kardashian stated, quote, "The Armenians demand the redemption of their national heritage from alien rule and its constitution into a free, self-governing, and independent state of Armenia. That is, they do not want to become a confederation. They do not want the slight suggestion of any direct or indirect political connection with any neighboring nation or racial entity."
Gregory, could you slow down your delivery just a bit?
Sure. That same month, Kardashian began a massive letter-writing campaign to other influential Americans, asking them to join the ACIA, and within a month received numerous responses to his membership drive. Kardashian sought a bipartisan committee composed of leading politicians, intellectuals, industrialists, labor leaders, religious figures, and he was highly successful in his efforts. The committee boasted 75 members, including 22 state governors, 3 U.S. senators, 1 congressman, and a host of other prominent figures such as William Jennings Bryan, former Republican presidential candidate Charles Evans Hughes, former Harvard University president Charles Eliot, labor leader Samuel Gompers, and Zionist leader Rabbi Stephen Wise. The ACIA's 9-member executive committee consisted of Hughes, Eliot, Republican Senators Lodge and Elihu Root, Democratic Senator John Sharp Williams, Democratic Governor of New York Alfred Smith, and Frederick Cortland Penfield and Cleveland H. Dodge. The chairman of the executive committee was James W. Gerard, former American ambassador to Germany, Democratic Party official from New York, and the personal friend of Kardashian's. Although Gerard was an ardent Armenophile and a loyal friend, he may not have been a good choice for chairman on Kardashian's part because President Wilson had a low opinion of him. In 4 years, the ACIA had only 4 meetings with 15 or more members present, but the other members were regularly informed of the lobby's activities. It seems that Kardashian did most of the ACIA work. It wrote most of its letters, telegrams, and pamphlets. Used their names on its dispatches. The committee had its initial meeting on February 8, 1919, at the Hotel Plaza in New York. About 400 supporters and members attended, including Charles Evans Hughes, who gave a stirring speech in favor of Armenian independence. At the end of the meeting, the ACIA sent President Wilson a cable in support of Armenia. Wilson later I beg that you will assure the committee that I will be as watchful as possible to do my utmost on Armenia's behalf. The ACIA did not have a central strategy, but instead reacted to events as they were unfolding. It first sent cables to Paris, where Wilson was negotiating with Allied leaders, informing him of widespread American support for Armenian independence. Several petitions signed by numerous political and religious leaders were sent to him as well. Kardashian also closely followed the deliberations of the peace conference and directed the ACIA to cable Wilson to defend Armenian territorial rights, particularly from French imperialist plans. During the spring of 1919, the ACIA learned that the Wilson administration was considering accepting a mandate for Armenia. Kardashian therefore organized a meeting to explain the Armenian view on this question at the Bankers Club, New York, on May 22, 1919. 50 prominent Americans attended, of whom 25 were ACIA members, and others the editors of leading New York newspapers. On Kardashian's recommendation, the meeting cabled Wilson, stating that they fully supported the president on this issue. The editor of the New York Times and the manager of the Associated Press were among the signatories. Wilson was gratified with the group's response. However, not all ACIA members supported the mandate. Lodge, in particular, believed in direct aid to Armenia as opposed to the mandate proposal. Nonetheless, Kardashian, Gerard, and other ACIA members publicized the mandate idea, hoping to solicit American public support for the proposal. Both Gerard and Kardashian stressed that the mandate would be limited in nature, lasting only 5 to 10 years. When Armenia had been redeveloped, the country could easily pay back her loans. Moreover, Kardashian emphasized that American military presence will not have to be substantial, because, given sufficient munitions and supplies, Armenia could easily create a force of 75,000 soldiers. Writing in the New York Times on July 6, 1919, Girard, in an effort to appeal to as broad an audience as he could, gave 22 reasons why America should accept the mandate for Armenia, including Christian duty, the propagation of Anglo-Saxon civilization in the Near East, and the necessity of a mandate for the survival of Armenia. Yet Wilson delayed his decision to submit the mandate to the Senate because he believed that the Versailles Treaty with the League of Nations Covenant should be first ratified before the mandate proposal was raised. Unfortunately for the Armenians, this delay proved to be fateful because of internationalism in general and pro-Armenian sentiment in particular was at its height during the first half of 1919. Leading American newspapers and several state legislatures passed resolutions in favor of the mandate, and there was widespread support from the American public as well. However, as the year 1919 dragged on, isolationism gathered more and more support, thereby hindering U.S. assistance to Armenia. With the mandate proposal delayed, the ACIA then attempted to sustain the Armenian Republic. At the end of June 1919, the Executive Committee of the ACIA cabled Wilson requesting that the United States or the Allies send troops to the Armenian Republic. The American responded to the cable by saying that the Armenians would not be helped by military aid, but only by the deployment of troops. That summer, the security of the Armenian Republic deteriorated as renewed Turkish massacres against the Armenians occurred. In response to this threatening situation, Republicans Lodge and Root told Girard in August that Wilson could send troops to Armenia if he wished. But Wilson did not take advantage of this opportunity, believing that such a move might antagonize Congress and provide ammunition for its anti-treaty forces. Moreover, Wilson did not trust Lodge, whom he considered a shameless hypocrite in Armenian affairs. Writing to his friend, John Sharp Williams, with congressional authorization. Wilson did, however, send a stern warning to the Turks about renewed aggressions against the Armenians. To overcome the constitutional problem of the president sending troops to Armenia, Senator Williams sought congressional authorization for such an action. On September 8, 1919, Williams introduced a resolution in the Senate to allow the president to send troops to Armenia and send munitions and supplies, and suspend the Foreign Enlistment Act to allow Armenian Americans to join the Armenian army. The ACI successfully persuaded Lodge not to oppose legislation, but as Senate Majority Leader, he assigned two hardline reservationists, Warren G. Hardy and Harry S. New, to the three-member subcommittee, along with Williams. Even before the hearings on the resolution took place, Williams was not optimistic, because he believed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was against it. Indeed, Lodge wrote to Root on September 29, 1919, that Congress would not possibly think of sending troops at this time. Williams believed that the resolution would have a better chance of acceptance without the passage on troop deployment. However, Wilson refused, stating that the very existence of the Armenian people requires the sending of troops. Even though the political situation looked unpromising, the Armenians' hopes were raised when the subcommittee on the Williams resolution invited Armenian leaders to testify. Kouymjian gave impressive testimony himself, but the committee hearings did not result in anything, and the Armenian question became immersed in the League of Nations debate. At about the same time, the mandate proposal arose again. A report by General Harbord, who had been sent to Armenia on a fact-finding mission, recommended all of European Anatolian Turkey and Transcaucasus be governed by a single mandatory power, and that the United States was best suited for this responsibility. Since this mandate closely resembled the type of mandate supported by American missionaries such as Caleb Gates and Ernest Riggs, the ACIA became alarmed, and then the ACIA turned against the mandate proposal. Kouymjian called it a pan-Turanian scheme because it would link Turks in Anatolia to other Turks in who was supportive of the mandate proposal. In the early part of 1920, the ACIA lobbied for U.S. recognition of the Armenian Republic. American inaction on this issue may have been the result of the influence of Mark Lambert Bristol, U.S. High Commissioner in Turkey, who frequently sent dispatches to Washington advising against the recognition of the Armenian Republic. Nonetheless, the United States finally recognized the Armenian Republic on April 23, 1920. 3 days later, the Allies meeting at San Remo in Italy to discuss the Turkish settlement asked Wilson to accept the mandate for Armenia, which was to include four Turkish Armenian provinces. Wilson accepted this invitation on May 17. In the Senate Harding Subcommittee on Armenia made a report early in April rejecting the Williams resolution, and Lodge informed Girard that the Senate would not accept the mandate either. Lodge replied it was only the Senate was so immersed in isolation that they could not possibly think of sending troops or a substitute for the Williams Resolution May 11th, which only came back to the Armenian Republic, and that was the most the Williams Resolution, or the substitute resolution for the Williams Resolution was able to do. Then at this time, the ACI learned that Wilson might ask the Senate for a mandate for Armenia. Girard then informed Secretary of State Colby that the overwhelming majority of senators opposed it and that its rejection would be fatal to Armenia. He then urged that instead of recommending the mandate, the President should send whatever aid he could without reference to Congress. However, throughout 1920, Wilson believed he could only aid Armenia with congressional authorization. Despite ACI requests to do otherwise, Wilson asked the Senate on May 24, 1920 to accept the mandate for Armenia. To no one's surprise, it was overwhelmingly defeated a week later. The only surprise was Wilson's decision to submit this mandate at this late stage. Given the entanglement of the Armenian question in the American foreign policy debate, it was perhaps fitting, though still ironic, that it was Henry Cabot Lodge who led the fight in the Senate to kill the mandate. Although he was cordial to pro-Senate senators such as John Sharp Williams, he nevertheless wanted a resounding defeat in order to embarrass his enemy, Woodrow Wilson. The use of the Armenian question in his personal fight demonstrated how secondary this issue had become for the supposed Armenophile. And with the defeat of the mandate and defeat of the Williams Resolution, there was no hope that the United States would help the Armenians.
That's it.
In conclusion, this study has shown that the ACIA grid of specific community needs and problems. Having small numbers, few resources, sharp political divisions, and little experience in dealing with the American political system, the community was in a poor position to mount an effective lobbying effort, as the ANUA demonstrated. Yet the need for an effective lobby was imperative, given the opportunity to assist in creating an independent Armenian state. Additionally, with the missionary establishment already in a strong position to influence the United States government on Armenian issues, the Armenians themselves needed an organization that would represent their needs. The driving force behind this strategy was Vahan Kardashian, who could bridge the gap between the immigrant and the establishment. But Kardashian was never able to represent the entire Armenian community. The ACIA proved to be largely ineffective, mainly because of the growth of isolationism, which dealt a grievous blow to U.S. assistance plans for Armenia. A contributing factor in that Wilson refused to take the initiative to help Armenia if that meant weakening their position on the controversial League of Nations question. And the League of Nations question always took precedent over the Armenian issue. Thus, although a non-ethnic lobby made much sense given the shortcomings of the Armenian American community, it also had its drawbacks, because a non-Armenian supporter was prone to neglect the Armenian issue in the interests of his major goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Edward Minasian, is a scholar and an Armenian activist and educator, and extremely active in California, particularly in the Oakland community. He is a social science teacher who received his MA from Berkeley in 1961. Anniversary of the Armenian community in California. When I was a young kid, I thought pretty much Watertown and Fresno was it. I didn't know there were Armenians in other places. But it's great to have you here because you have written on the Armenian people in the United States. That was your thesis, became the basis of some articles subsequently, and you have participated in organizing language and history class programs in community colleges in Oakland, and you're very active in the Armenian Apostolic Church in Oakland and in other ways. So, please come and tell us about the Musa Dagh.
Thank you, Professor Fuchs. I would be remiss if I just didn't take a moment and express my appreciation to Bob Myrak and Manuk Young and NAASR for extending me this invitation to participate in this conference. For me, it's a sentimental journey. This is my third NAASR conference, and it affords me the opportunity to come back to the land of my roots, since I was born and brought up in Laurence, Massachusetts. But then I couldn't take the winters anymore, and California became my adopted abode. Some years ago, when I first read Musa Dagh, I fell in love with it, and I had an obsession that this should be a motion picture. And as we all know, it suffered many delays. And in 1981, I finally got off the dime, and I made an appointment through Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to have access to their files on Musa Dagh. And I spent a week down in the studios at Culver City. I thought I would just see a shelf full of documents and memos and inter-office communications, and when the young lady brought in 4 supermarket baskets full of sheaves and sheaves of paper, I almost fell off my chair. I thought I could do this in a day or two. I was there for an entire week, put in over 70 hours going through everything they had. It's a massive source of information, and what I did was to tape it so I could get it all down inside about 70 hours. And then when I returned home, I transcribed into notes, and my original intention was to write an article for a film magazine. Well, the article now is over 200 pages long. Introduce the movie. My paper this morning is going to be limited to the 1930s. I call it the 40 years of Musa Dagh, the first phase, the 1930s. After 50 years of waiting, dream of Armenians now a reality. So read the ads in the California Armenian newspapers announcing the world motion picture premiere of Franz Werfel's The 40 Days of Musa Dagh in April 1982. The trade paper Daily Variety had at one time called it possibly the most on-again, off-again major literary property in the history of American motion pictures. Most of the premiere's attendees were probably unaware of the crucible that Werfel's novel had been subjected to since Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, had bought the screen rights in 1934. It is among Hollywood's most controversial and politicized projects. As a potential film, it endured innumerable delays, false starts, cancellations, rewriting, foreign meddling, and governmental pressure. Figuratively, it traversed a corporate, cinematic, corporate minefield that caused another of Tinseltown's papers, the Hollywood Reporter, to remark that Musa Dagh was one of the film world's lost projects. It was during Franz Werfel's second Near Eastern trip in 1929, and on his insistence that his companion and future wife, Alma Mahler, consented to visit Damascus to hear her to set forth on a journey that was to lead to a literary masterpiece. In that ancient city, they visited a carpet weaving plant. The owner personally conducted the couple through the factory. Passing along rows of looms, they were visibly shaken by the sight of emaciated children with El Greco faces and enormous eyes. What strange children are these? Werfel inquired. These poor creatures, they're the children of Armenians killed off by the Turks. Leaving the factory in a daze, Werfel was unable to get the scrawny children out of his mind. It proved to be the catalyst that inspired his epic novel, The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. Upon his return home to Vienna, he arranged to get complete files on the Armenian massacres from the French Ministry of War in Paris. It was worse than all the horror stories he had heard. The compulsion to write about the Armenian tragedy of World War I had a secondary source of determination, namely the rise of Adolf Hitler. In March 1933, Werfel completed his book. His wife noted it as a titanic achievement for a Jew to write a work like this at this time, exposed to such animosities. By September of that year, Werfel had involuntarily joined an illustrious and a unique group whose books were being burned in Nazi Germany. In his research, he had discovered the story of the Armenian villages of the Musa Dagh region, an area along the Gulf of Alexandretta. Rather than submit to the Turkish directive to abandon their homes and join relocation convoys to the Syrian desert, they had chosen to defend themselves atop Musa Dagh, the mountain of Moses. After 53 days, they were rescued by a French fleet and taken to sanctuary in Port Said, Egypt. Drawing on this event, Werfel found his main theme and wove such a story that upon its publication in Vienna and New York, it electrified the literary world and the public imagination. And heroic story written in our time. Louis Cronenberger, editor of the New York Times Book Review, prophetically noted that if Hollywood does not mar and mishandle it, it should make a magnificent movie. And perhaps the most poignant comment was Werfel's personal note in the preface of his book, when he was given the final impulse to snatch from the Hades of all that was this incomprehensible destiny of the Armenian nation. While the literary world was in a flurry over Werfel's novel, another monumental story was unfolding in that Never Never Land, Hollywood. Reigning over Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, the studio that had more stars than in heaven, were two moguls who were the epitomes of high-rolling and successful movie makers, Louis B. Mayer and Irving G. Thalberg. They are among the royalty of the mythical kingdom called Hollywood. 10 months before Werfel's novel was published in the United States, MGM had been sent a synopsis of the story. A perusal of the summary inspired Mayer to acquire what had been predicted to be a hot property. Werfel's Viennese publisher convinced his client A few weeks later, J. Robert Rubin, an executive at Lowe's Incorporated, MGM's parent company, admonished Mayer that the theme of Werfel's novel was so delicate that it could be dangerous. Rubin advised that the film be approached with caution so as not to offend the Turks. Prior to the book's American publication, consideration was already being given to cast the movie and choose the production team. David O. Selznick, Mayer's son-in-law and an MGM producer, thought of making one Turk the villain rather than fault an entire nation and people. His intention was to make clear that by and large Turks oppose atrocities and in this manner place MGM on safe ground. It was Selznick's recommendation to the New York corporate headquarters that Rubin asked Major Frederick Heron, the foreign manager of the Hayes office in Washington, to contact the Turkish ambassador as a matter of courtesy. Selznick's naivete proved to be the door to Pandora's box. Unwittingly, it gave the Kemalist government a head start in circumventing the filming of Musa Dagh. It had become an overnight sensation, selling 35,000 copies within 2 weeks. It was a record for 1934. Viking press was soon deluged with suggestions that for Metro to make Musa Dagh into a great movie. Just before the novel appeared in American bookstores, Will Hayes, president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America and Hollywood's in-house moralist and official censor, received a communique from Wallace Murphy, Chief of Near Eastern Affairs for the Secretary of State. The gist of the message was to inform Hayes of the concern expressed by Munir Bey, the Turkish ambassador to the United States. that Werfel's bestseller was to become a movie. Murphy had promised the State Department's cooperation in checking on the matter. Hayes' response was immediate. He had read the scenario and saw no reference to the Armenian massacres, but only an emphasis on the book's characters. He reassured Murphy of his confidence in MGM and was convinced that the finished product would contain nothing that will offend the Turkish ambassador or his countrymen. The pressure began to build. Sometime later, Murphy advised Heron that the Turkish ambassador was upset about a report that Irving Thalberg had assigned Kerry Wilson to write the Musa Dagh screenplay and that William Wellman was to direct the movie with William Powell in the lead. It was Murphy's opinion that Munir Bey's real concern was that the proposed film would accentuate Christian-Muslim animosity and especially the Armenian massacres. Bey had insisted that the production's timing was inopportune and stressed that it not mislead the American public through erroneous features regarding Turkey's history. Heron was reminded by Murphy that the State Department referred its promised cooperation to the ambassador and expected the Hayes accordingly. Heron proved to be a veritable troubleshooter. He immediately contacted Hayes' second command, Joseph Breen, that he was cognizant of the Turkish concern and that MGM's production was being watched. He expressed his regrets that someone at the studio had leaked the news of Thalberg's interview. To placate the sensitive Turks, he had promised the State Department on his own authority that nothing along those lines be further given out. He urged Breen to warn Metro of the Turks' interests so would not be surprised by the Turkish government and that of their allies. The Armenian community over the MGM announcement that the 40 Days of Musa Dagh would be among its top priority films for 1935 in company with the Great Ziegfeld and Mutiny on the Bounty. Meanwhile, communications between the Turkish embassy, the State Department, and heat reality. J.R. Rubin was quick to relay to Thalberg that he had confidential information that the Turkish government was so incensed with MGM's recalcitrance that if Musa Dagh was not cancelled, then it was inevitable for all MGM films to be banned from Turkey and perhaps all American films as well. Rubin had been shown a document labeled "For Official Eyes," stating that the Turkish authorities were prepared to expend every effort all over the world to prohibit the picture. That a proposed movie could so enrage a government was something the MGM power brokers were too inexperienced to comprehend as yet. The fact that within a few months Werfel's book had become a bestseller in 18 languages reinforced Turkey's opposition to the movie. It became an obsession, warranting top priority by the Ankara government. The Turks marshaled their forces. Friendly governments were alerted as to the machinations of the MGM hierarchy and by implication the United States government. Turkish professionals and businessmen wrote to their foreign counterparts expressing their concerns that Musa Dagh would create a bad impression in Eastern countries against American films. The Son Posta, an Istanbul newspaper, had already launched a campaign suggesting that Turkey's friends should advise America that such a film would only bring about hatred and misunderstanding. The Turkish efforts were not in vain. The State Department began to feel uneasy and apprehensive. Recognizing the serious nature of the Turkish anger and threats, additional pressure was applied to the Hayes office. But it was clear MGM was convinced that the thing of Musa Dagh would cause Turkey to do everything in its power to prevent its screening. Furthermore, Metro should realize that the revival of the Armenian question could serve no useful purpose. out in the trade papers and the national press, reporting the controversy engendered by Musa Dagh. For the studio to back out now, it would not only sacrifice the financial investment and waste much favorable publicity, but lose a public already primed by Werfel's novel. For some of the journeymen at MGM, there was a principle at stake. Could a foreign government be allowed to suppress the making of an American motion picture? Could it set a dangerous precedent? Whatever the stakes were, lines, collectively the studio heads mobilized their first forces and laid out their battle plans. Thalberg instructed Samuel Marks, an MGM story editor, to join Rubin in Washington and see the Turkish ambassador with Kerry Wilson's Musa Dagh script in hand. Mayer alerted all the interested parties that the issue was being considered at the highest level. In an unprecedented act, J. Robert Rubin met personally with the Turkish ambassador Munir Bey in Washington, and in another unique gesture, gave him a copy of Kerry Wilson's screenplay. The ambassador agreed to give the script his attention and respond with his comments. Frederick Herron, speaking for the Hayes office, wrote to Wallace Murphy at the State Department that Rubin was hoping to elicit from the Turkish ambassador a degree of cooperation and understanding that would be mutually satisfactory to all parties. Murphy was assured that Musa Dagh would have nothing in it suggesting the Armenian massacres. In Herron's opinion, the paranoia expressed in Ankara and in the Turkish press was unwarranted. To step up the pressure on MGM and give credence to the genuine concern of the Turkish government, Louis Mayer had received a translation of an article appearing in the Istanbul press entitled, "They Will Be the Losers." In essence, it was highly critical of the studio for making a film against us. The article's author insisted the real culprits in stirring up the issue were Armenian propagandists whose intentions were to seize upon the movie as a tool to rouse world opinion against Turkey. The fact that MGM bought the rights to Werfel's book was just too bitter a pill for the Turks to swallow. Fanning the flames of Turkish outrage, the article falsely stated that production had already begun and that Clark Gable, MGM's #1 box office star, was to play the leading role. The movie was given the maintenance and improvement of Turkish-American relations. MGM was promised a box office failure thanks to a boycott by Turkey, France, and the Balkan countries. In conclusion, the article's author regretted the absence of a pro-Turkish organization in the United States that would counter anti-Turkish propaganda in the future. The movie had become a cause célèbre. Communications between the parties involved amounted like $1 million production gone awry. MGM was bombarded with constant reminders from the State Department, the Hayes office, the Turkish embassy, the press, and its own studio executives that the production of Musa Dagh would have great repercussions. The controversy eventually focused on the man at the helm, Irving Thalberg, the brain behind the Musa Dagh project. He was strongly advised to consider the consequences resulting from such a movie. Once again, the opposition was reassured that the production would be launched only after the Turkish authorities approved the script. And yet it was the general conclusion at MGM that the Turks would disavow such approval once the film was distributed. Unfortunately, one of the glaring weaknesses in the case of Musa Dagh was the involved MGM staff. For the most part, they had not read Werfel's book. They were ignorant of its theme and its significance to Armenians and its potential for Turkish fury. There is no question that the studio bosses were genuinely worried. They seriously considered sending a well-established diplomatic person to Turkey immediately before its ambassador responded to the script. Rubin was afraid that a negative Turkish answer would make it extremely difficult to reopen the matter, either because he gave in to the pressure exerted by the corporate heads, or just to ward them off. Rubin became that well-established diplomatic person. In August 1935, he decided to sail to Europe in order to deal firsthand with a situation that had been overblown in an international affair. From Paris, he wired Mayer and Thalberg of his difficulties with the Turkish envoys. In order to restore calm, Rubin recommended that in the interim, MGM refrain from any publicity about Musa Dagh. Indicative of his commitment, he intended to send MGM's Paris representative to Turkey to pay since governmental permission most often pertained to locating camera crews in foreign countries. Musa Dagh was scheduled to be shot in Culver City. The energy, time, and money expended on Musa Dagh by MGM began to take its toll. Questions were raised as to the worth of the production. There was some who suggested backing off, not so much as to appease the Hayes office and the State Department or even the Turks, but that other studio concerns had to be addressed. Joining the mounting opposition was Metro's man in Istanbul, Fahir Epekci. He emphatically advised his employer that MGM's business would be greatly harmed. It was incomprehensible of the studio to think that Turkey would ever give its approval to the movie. It would be a contradiction, since Werfel's book was already banned in Turkey. Epekci was determined to convince MGM that it was indulging in a futile exercise. Negotiations were useless. The Turkish government would never accept the script, and even if it were changed to satisfy the Turks, the title would always be unacceptable. The film should be abandoned. The furor that ensued renewed ancient antagonisms between Turks and Armenians. In the 1930s, the largest Armenian community remaining in Turkey was centered in Istanbul. It too felt the barbs coming from the Turkish press and officialdom to understand the Turkish position. There was no doubting the intent of the message. It had its desirous effect. Turkish Armenians joined the protest against Musa Dagh and communicated their concerns to MGM and their compatriots in the United States. For the time being, MGM was holding to its commitment. Rubin received the confidential letter recommending script alterations to placate the Turks who were then examining the screenplay in Ankara. For a brief moment, there was a sigh of relief when the Turkish ambassador informed the New York office that with some script changes, the Turkish government may revise its position. Nothing definite, nothing official, just a hopeful sign awaiting the official communique. By the hopeful sign was a hoax in its inception, a delaying action. MGM was beginning to understand that foreign diplomacy could be just as misleading as the games playing in Hollywood. The anti-Musa Dagh campaign escalated by the day in the Turkish press. It became a front page item in Hurriyet and La Republique. They demanded MGM issue an official declaration terminating the production. The whole affair was now unraveling beyond expectation and comprehension. It even threatened Franco-Turkish relations vis-a-vis the Muslims in North Africa. The official Turkish decision finally reached Culver City on September 27, 1935. Ankara relayed its position via the Turkish ambassador Munir Bey. And there was no misunderstanding its thrust. The script was so antagonistic to Turkey that she will do everything in her power to stop the movie. Alterations and or deletions could never be made satisfactory. It rekindles the Armenian question. The Armenian question is settled. How else would you explain the presence of Armenians in the Turkish parliament? MGM was threatened with a worldwide campaign and was accused of stirring up troubles about a situation that had been smoothed out and forgotten. The Turkish response was very effective and claimed a major convert. J. Robert Rubin was the first to throw in the towel. As far as he was concerned, the project had been denuded of its glamour and heroics. It was all aggravation now. Admitting the wonderful possibilities for Musa Dagh, he preferred that another studio make the picture. Even the Greeks, the Turks' ancient enemy, notified MGM that any contemplated production of the film in Greece would be prohibited. If Turkey's traditional foe supported her, could her friends do less? To hell with the Turks was Irving Thalberg's immediate reaction to the Turkish diatribe. He had already sounded out Ruben Mamoulian to direct Musa Dagh, but pragmatism would eventually Turkey France all Hollywood movies unless MGM accepted its demands. Relations between
Fascinating story.
well, they paid an awful lot of money to make 2,000 miles in California. You know?
Do what they do in the editing room, you know, in Hollywood.
Okay. That's what ruins movies.
You're about to kill
Turkey,
off the star. Very good.
Relations between Thalberg and Mayer became strained partly due to Musa Dagh. What can the Turks do if we make Musa Dagh? Okay, let them keep us out of their 30 movie theaters, said Thalberg. Mayer told him it was more serious than that. The Turks had threatened to ask friendly nations to ban all American movies. I can't fight that, Thalberg told Mamoulian on presenting him with his pink slip. The Wunderkind had met his match. When Mayer refused to carry the Musa Dagh fight to the State Department, the die had been cast. Thalberg was livid. We've lost our guts, and when that happens to a studio, you can kiss it goodbye. And so the mythical empire of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was first forced to capitulate to the real empire of Turkey. Franz Werfel had been oblivious to the maelstrom his novel had created. His literary triumph so swept this country that he and his wife were encouraged to visit the United States in late 1935. Basking in the adulation accorded them, the Werfels took time to acknowledge the outpouring of admiration and gratitude expressed by the Armenians of America. The New York colony honored Werfel at an immense banquet where he heard fiery speeches and received 6 standing ovations. Among the speakers was Henry Morgan Hall Sr., the former ambassador of Turkey during the Holocaust of 1915. So touched was Werfel by the reception that he attended Christmas services in a local Armenian church. We were a nation, said the priest in his sermon, but Franz Werfel gave us a soul. After the services, the entire congregation filed past to shake hands with the man who had revived their hopes in reminding the world of the 20th century's first genocide. Universally in the Armenian communities, there was no question that Werfel was their man of the hour. By virtue of writing one book, he had implanted himself permanently in the Armenian pantheon. Thanks to this diminutive Austrian Jew, Armenians had been given another bridge in their age-old efforts toward ethnic and national unity. Everywhere Armenians had taken on a concentrated interest in his book and its motion picture production because in one generation, the governments and the peoples of the world had forgotten the Armenian tragedy of World War I. Perhaps it was the intoxicating euphoria of the golden 20s that preoccupied them, or the Great Depression that followed, compounded by the isolationist attitude that had so permeated Western society as to excuse the appeasement of the totalitarians. The world had sufficiently immunized itself to ignore the lessons of history. In Turkey, there was jubilation upon learning that its ambassador's tenacity had brought about the intervention of the State Department. Munir Bey had thrown caution to the wind and gone straight to the top. In a letter of appreciation addressed to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, he reviewed the entire Turkish position. I'll skip up there.
2 pages.
I'd like to hear the rest of it. I'd like to hear the rest of it.
I would too, but we'll have to
Let's take a phone.
get the other. No, we have to move along on the schedule, and we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Well, let me end with this.
He's getting the Academy Award already.
someday. Anyway, there is this one quote from the State Department document MGM, from the ambassador to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. Now the movie was going to be canceled. None of this would have been possible without the efforts of the State Department. I'll have to end there. I timed myself several times, I'm sorry. Maybe you read the book, because it's over 200 pages long.
Absolutely fascinating. We'll come back to it in the question period. I have to be the bad guy. I am under strict instructions from the organizers. I'll take the blame. They say be ruthless, but we'll come back. That was fascinating, and now we have some more supporting actors. And Harold Takooshian is going to talk next, and his topic is on Armenian immigration to the United States today. Harold is a social psych. All right, now instead of after the third one?
Just 5 minutes.
All right, I thought after the third one. Okay. Okay, 5-minute break. Trying to understand why MGM wanted to cast William Powell in the leading Armenian role. And of course it was obvious. The Americans had heard about the starving Armenians. He had played the thin man. So it was typecasting. But MGM has sent a wire to the conference saying that they are reviving the production of the 40 Days of Musa Dagh starring Edward Minasian.
Hey, let me happen. I don't know about Minasian.
And Harold Takooshian, who is really a social psychologist and not an actor, will play a major role, also a very athletic role, because among the interesting things listed on his curriculum vitae is that he won varsity letters in gymnastics at CCNY. And he will be the fellow who will be leaping after the Turks over the hill. His paper is one that we want very much to hear. He's been doing work recently on ethnicity and feminism among American women. And I don't know if the Armenians are a focus of that or not, but his work ranges across a great many social psychological issues, and it's nice to have him here and to know that he is also a scholar of Armenian history, American Armenian history.
Thank you, Dr. Fuchs. Let me take about 30 seconds of my exactly 30 minutes to join the other panelists in praising NAASR. When I teach the course in industrial psychology at Fordham, I note that according to the U.S. Department of Labor, about 50% of new businesses go out of business within the first 2 years of their operation, and as rapidly as ever. It's very commendatory. I admire the preparation of the other panelists who all have prepared papers. For a couple of reasons, I don't have a prepared paper, but I have a brief handout if any of you are interested afterwards, summarizing some data that I'll be presenting. And could you stand up, Silva? My wife, Silva Barsumian, has worked with me a long time on the Armenian community, and she has the handouts too if you're curious after the presentation. As NAASR defined my topic, it's to discuss Armenian immigration today from the Middle East particularly, and Ms. Andreassian will discuss the Soviet Union. I could think of several questions that relate to this issue, questions that are quite interesting. For example, most of the immigration material on Armenians, of course, is we probably know more about the Armenian immigrants to this country around the turn of the century far more than we do about the Armenian immigrants today. Some questions would be, how many Armenian immigrants are coming to this country each year from anywhere, and particularly from the Middle East, the largest source, obviously. Which country are these Armenian immigrants coming from today that are coming to our shores? Demographically, who are these Armenian immigrants? Family life, how religious are they? Occupation, educational level, languages, we really don't know. Where do these immigrants, Armenians, settle in the United States? Is there any data on this? How well do Armenian immigrants adjust once they get here? And what effect do Armenian immigrants have on the Armenians who are already in this country, the native-born or first-generation Armenians? These are some questions, and I must apologetically say that I've looked hard, and there are very few answers. So I'm going to have to comment on problems in studying Armenians as well as what findings are available on these issues. Right from the outset, well, let me summarize what I'll be covering. Definitions of what an Armenian is, measurement issues, how do we measure how many Armenians are in this country or immigrating to this country. Some impressions, particularly 6 impressions I have of Armenian immigration to this country, particularly from the Middle East. First of all, then, the definition issue. It might sound like being overly picky, but exactly what is an Armenian? Let me ask you folks, how many of you are fluent in the Armenian language? Would you raise your hands? I would say it's about 2/3 of you. How many of you consider yourselves Armenian but do not speak Armenian? Would you raise your hands? That's about 10 of you, which is about 1/10 of you. I discern 3, perhaps 4 definitions of Armenian, and it's important to define it because different countries define what an Armenian is differently. There's the linguistic definition, the religious definition, the national definition, and what I would call the cultural definition. The most conservative definition of what an Armenian is the linguistic one. For example, the United States Census relies most heavily on this question: do you speak Armenian? It would be very nice to find out from the U.S. Census, since all this time and effort is spent every 10 years, how many Armenians live in this country. But according to the U.S. Census, about the most relevant question asked about Armenians, asked that involves Armenians as a category, as an answer, is do you speak Armenian? And in 1970, 100,495 people said yes. So if you looked in the census in 1970, how many Armenians are there? The answer would be 100,000. There's some unpublished data which I just obtained from the U.S. Census. In 1980, 102,000. So it's becoming much more popular to speak Armenian in this country by 2000. The point is that that's one definition of what an Armenian is, linguistic. And other countries often rely on that too. The Turks, for example, in their census of population, define Armenians linguistically rather than religiously or culturally. And their answer, by the way, in 1971, the most recent year I could get data, about 32,000 people in Turkey speak Armenian. A second definition is the religious definition, people who belong to the Armenian church. I think it's fair to say that most Armenians belong to the Armenian Orthodox Church, but not all. And certainly there are some Armenians, and particularly in the United States, when they go to church, they go down the block to the Catholic Church or a Protestant church. That is, they're not religiously Armenian, they wouldn't be counted in that figure. Just for your information, in the United States, according to the self-reports of the churches, not according to any U.S. Census or governmental data, about 372,000 people belong to the diocese, the Hovhaness Church, about 125,000 belong to the Galigia Church in the U.S., and often I hear that there are about 5% to 10% Armenians are Protestants. If you add those figures together, you get a figure of somewhere roughly a little over 500,000, according to self-reports of churches, Armenians by the religious definition in this country. The third definition, the national definition, Armenians as a nationality. And here we're talking about people who define themselves as Armenian or are defined as of Armenian ancestry. Among these three definitions, clearly it goes from most conservative to most liberal. In other words, if the government counts Armenians linguistically, they're going to get a much smaller number. If they count Armenians religiously, a larger number. If they count Armenians nationally, they're going to get the largest number, if they consider Armenians a nationality. Incidentally, I was surprised that the U.S. Census in 1980, we were told at the Early Assembly, the Armenian Assembly in 1974, that there would be an effort to count Armenians as an ethnic group in the 1980 census, but that has only partly come to fruition. The U.S. Census did ask people their ancestry and did include Armenians as a separate category in 1980, an ancestry category. Before that, Armenians had always been clumped as an other. According to the 1980 U.S. Census, there are 212,621 people of Armenian ancestry in this country, much larger than the linguistic figure, 102,000. At any rate, I go through these figures mainly to point out that there are different definitions of what an Armenian is. The fourth definition I mentioned, besides linguistic, religious, and national, I call it the cultural or the ethnic definition. This is not a dichotomy. The other is you're either Armenian or not. But the cultural definition, which as a psychologist I personally prefer, sees ethnicity as a continuum, how involved a person is in their community. But such a definition is very hard to apply unless there's a lot of money and a lot of effort put into defining how Armenian each person is. That definition is never used by demographers to my knowledge. I mentioned the definitions of Armenian. Let me cover some efforts to measure, let me describe the Armenian community in the Middle East demographically, and then try to tie this to trends in immigration to this country. There's no question that the Middle East is in a state of flux, not only the Armenians, but the whole populations that are living there today, and certainly for the past 30 years. And Armenians have been in flux as much, if not more, than the other nationalities living in the Middle East. As Mr. Liberidium points out in one of his articles in 1981, there are a couple of reasons why Armenians are concentrated in the Middle East. Partly because Armenians are near their ancestral homeland and want to stay there, and partly because of the issue of the Armenian cause, that is, the idea that someday Armenians will return to the Middle East. It's a natural home for Armenians to have been in the Middle East and to want to stay there. It's a comfortable environment for them. However, Professor Hovhanessian, in a 1974 to document exactly how many Armenians are in the Middle East and where they are and what they're doing, Hovhanessian notes that there's been sort of a domino effect. Armenians are obviously a very achieving culture. Dr. Fuchs noted that earlier. A very achieving culture, and certainly in the Middle East they've adopted a preeminent role economically, financially, in just about every way you can measure. It's estimated that about 400,000 Armenians went, because of the deportations in 1915, from Turkey to various countries in the Middle East, a total of 400,000. And when you look at them much later in the 1950s and 60s, we see that the Armenian community in Egypt was a very strong one. About 50,000 Armenians were in Egypt, and they had a very good position until 1952. Suddenly, NAASR, revolution, Islamization of Egypt, the Armenian picture went bad. Armenians started emigrating from Egypt. The same thing happened in Syria, 1958. Syria joined this United Arab Republic. Dashnags in that country were prosecuted for crimes of sedition. Armenian schools came under state control in 1967, Arabic language became mandatory. Armenian language and studies were discouraged. An estimated 170,000 Armenians were in Syria and began fleeing. Iraq. King Faisal was assassinated in 1958. It's hard to get a figure of how many Armenians were living there, but the population now is under 10,000. It's interesting that when Hovhaness was amassing his statistics in 1974, he was pointing to a sort of optimistic conclusion that, well, at least there's Lebanon. It's a democratic country, Armenians are very strong there, it's a safe haven. At least Armenians who migrated from Egypt and Syria have found Lebanon and can stay in the Middle East. And we know what happened after 1974. Again, the domino effect. Lebanon entered a civil war. According to estimates by the Armenian prelacy and by a particular Armenian official in Yejibiu, Burj Setrakian, roughly 50,000 Armenians of the 250,000 living in Lebanon in 1974 had fled very soon afterward. 1976, fled very soon afterwards. Iran, another country where Armenian population is of record size, Armenians are very prosperous, and in 1979, again, persecution, a new regime, attempt at Islamization, and Armenians there too. My point is clear that the Armenians are comfortable and strong in the Middle East, and yet the situation is so unstable there that the Middle East has become the #1 source of Armenian emigration to the United States. The United States has proven to be a magnet for immigrants around the world, but particularly Armenian immigrants, and particularly from the Middle East. An estimated 515,000 Armenians total were living in the Middle East. It's kind of questionable how many have come here today. Moving to another issue, measurement. How do we know how many Armenians have left the Middle East? How do we know how many immigrants are coming to this country today? Even if we were able to choose one particular definition of Armenian as best, we would have to measure somehow. And I would call the Armenian immigrants to the United States invisible immigrants. It is absolutely remarkable how hard it is to estimate how many Armenians are coming to this country. There is just no data. They're like ghosts. After all, if an Armenian comes from Lebanon to the United States, how is he classified? Lebanese. Does the United States ask for religion when a person enters? No, it's almost unheard to ask that. Does the government ask what language a person speaks when they come into this country? No. The fact is, Armenians are almost totally invisible. Once they cross from their countries in the Middle East, where they're often categorized by religion and ethnicity, once they cross the Atlantic, they don that cloak of invisibility, and American demographers are virtually powerless to figure out who's who. We can guess how many Armenians are coming here from the Middle East. And let me briefly cover this data. It falls into two categories: American-based data and foreign-based data. If we look at American data, we look at the census. But I previously pointed out that's inadequate. The census just doesn't get a good count of Armenians in this country. We have to rely on other sources than the government. Immigration data. Immigration data is worthless here. It does not record the number of Armenians coming into this country. There's no way of guessing, with the possible exception, I'd be interested in hearing Ms. Andreassian speak about this, about Soviet Armenians, where the State Department does seem to be a little bit more careful about defining who's coming into this country from the Soviet Union. The Armenian Church is a source of data. But here, I don't know who puts the statistics together for the church. Maybe Archbishop Saroyan will have a comment after the panel, and he could clarify how the churches come up with their estimates. Did you write it down? Not now, though, but Armenian agencies. Perhaps Armenian agencies have statistics. Well, you're looking at one person then who should have some statistics. I worked with several Armenian agencies through the 70s, and I do have some statistics on needy Armenians, and which only to tell you to ask for one of these sheets later on. I won't go over those statistics now, except to say that the statistics Armenian agencies like the AGBU or the Diocese Social Service or the Armenian Evangelical Social Service, these statistics on our immigrant Armenians are somewhat limited because they're based on people in need, the Armenian immigrants who are needy. The Armenian immigrants who are not only needy but need help from strangers. The ones who are needy and get help from their family are never seen by the Armenian service agencies. And also, the Armenian agencies get self-report data from these immigrants. In other words, the immigrants don't have to prove things about themselves. They could say their age or financial status or whatever, and the agency will take their word for it. There are two large repositories of Armenian data in the United States, which, to my knowledge, have hardly been tapped. One is ANCHA, the American National Committee to Aid Homeless Armenians. Now, ANCHA was started in 1947 and keeps very meticulous records because of ICOM, because of the governmental body that requires them to keep records on families, the names, family size, education, occupation. ANCHA has over 25,000 records right now, which are in excellent order. And to my knowledge, only one researcher has even begun to study them, Ara Gazarians. Is Ara here right now? No. Lives in the Boston area, and 25,000 immigrants. I would love to do a regression analysis of factors that contribute to Armenian immigration, but the data needs to be coded, and it's just an immense amount. And another source of immigration, U.S. immigration data that I know of that hasn't been tapped is Kirill Padukian. Mr. Padukian is such a wonderful man. He's deceased now, who lived in Canada, who has records on about 4,000 immigrants that he personally helped to emigrate to Canada, and very carefully collected and analyzed. With the exception of Asha and Padukian's data, the data in the available in the United States tends to be in shambles. It's very poor and hard to generalize how many immigrants are coming, much less their demographic qualities. I said that there's a second source of data on Armenian immigrants to the United States, and that is relying on the foreign governments, foreign statistics. And here there is some data, not only from the censuses in, let's say, Syria, or, well, Lebanon doesn't have a census, but let's say censuses in Syria or Iraq or wherever, or Turkey. For example, I spoke with a fellow who was doing his master's thesis in Germany, and I asked him if he knew how many Armenians were leaving Turkey because he was closer to the data from his end. And he said no, but he came up with the same figure I did. In 1960, the Turkish government, using a linguistic definition of Armenians, recorded 52,000 Armenians living in Turkey. In 1971, using the same definition, they found 32,000 Armenians living in Turkey. The way I read that is that 20,000 Armenians went someplace. That someplace tends to be the United States, not Europe. Well, there are other examples too, but I won't go into them. Where foreign data can be used to track how many people are leaving a country, and then we can try to estimate how many of them are coming to this country. Let me give you some impressions on the demographics of Armenians in this country. Can you tell me how time-wise?
About 8.5 minutes.
Very good. I wish the demographers were as precise as you. Let me give you some impressions about the Armenian immigration to this country, and also how these Armenian immigrants are received. Some, I would say, psychological interpretations. Unfortunately, the data is not as hard as an experimental psychologist like I would like. I should mention that in 1971 I was working with the AGBU, as a volunteer, and we weren't asked to start any kind of social service at the AGBU to help immigrants coming into this country, but I learned that it was tragic. I learned that the AGBU was constantly getting phone calls from people. I need immigration help, I need social service help, can you help me find a job? Apparently the AGBU overseas focuses more on social service than the AGBU in this country. And yes, a couple of cases broke my heart. So on our own, the young people group at the AGBU in New York City undertook some social services. we've seen people be deported. We've seen people, one woman sleeping in a doctor's office until the office opened at 9 a.m. Then she would have to disappear, and she'd come back at 6 and be able to stay in the office and sleep there. In other words, really destitute Armenians. We started a social service there, and we wanted to start an immigration service. One particular official in the HEBU turned us down. We asked for $350 to send one of our people to an immigration course to help people immigrate, fill out the forms, etc. We went to various organizations, and finally the Armenian Prelacy helped us, and I spent about a year there working in their immigration service, where we gave people immigration counseling. Silva and Arid Bulbul, a couple of people took the training and helped them. Also, I worked in the diocese doing an evaluation of their pilot service for immigrants, and have some fragmentary data there. We did a very thorough evaluation of the characteristics of the immigrants coming in, what they wanted, why they couldn't get jobs, what were the impediments, and we have some data from there. So let me give you these impressions about Armenian immigrants, particularly from the Middle East, and their reception once here. First of all, it amounts to really 5 points. The first point, our statistics on the world Armenian population are very spotty. I covered that already. A second point, Armenian immigrants, Armenian population in the diaspora is very much in a state of flux, particularly gravitating towards North America. I think I covered that point quite enough. Third point, there's virtually no data on Armenian immigrants. I covered that point enough. Fourth point, where are the Armenian immigrants settling? Between our agency in New York and Aincha in particular did a survey. We sensed that most Armenians were not coming to New York as they had been around the turn of the century, but instead they're going to California. And indeed, when we analyzed records, Aincha records, we found that 17% this country, 14% went virtually straight to California. The other 20-odd% is broken down into miscellaneous categories. But the point is that clearly within the U.S., the magnet for Armenian immigration is California. About their occupation and social mobility of these immigrants coming over. Around the turn of the century, when the U.S. government did follow up Armenian immigrants quite a bit, they were found to be the second most prosperous, upwardly socially mobile group economically, next to the Polish Jews. And I think that's still true today. It's remarkable how the people who came through Aincha, yeah, 5, okay, we're all conscious, but it's very good that you do this. People who come from Aincha, R.P. Papazian, the New York director, tells me that it's remarkable how many of them are currently millionaires, who came with very little funds and have risen to prominence. I think that would be an interesting study if someone were willing to follow up those immigrants on a systematic sampling. About the language, Armenians tend to be multilingual, but my experience is that, well, actually we found only 33% of people who came to the social services that we offered spoke English. That's a big problem for Armenians coming to this country who appear at the social services. English tends not to be one of the languages they speak for some reason, and makes them almost ineligible for jobs. A fourth of the 5 points I want to cover is Armenian demographics of Armenians in the United States. I would say, for one thing, that Armenians are a remarkably high percentage of foreign-born. I think few groups in the United States, cultural groups, have such a high percentage of foreign-born. It's hard to put a figure on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were 50%. It's remarkable how many Armenians are born overseas rather than first or second generation. There's probably less known about Armenians in this country than about any major ethnic group of 500,000 in number. I noticed that research on Armenians in this country tends to be done, like, frankly, like my research, on the back of envelopes. That is, there is no well-funded intelligentsia that tries to study Armenians in this country. It tends to be people who, on their initiative, try to collect statistics where none are being collected. And that causes us to know even less about Armenians in this country. A fourth point, also part about Armenians in the United States, what impression Americans have of Armenians in this country. The preliminary data I've collected on my own survey, the survey I was doing, is that Americans know nothing about very little, except terrorists here and there. And finally, a fifth thing about Armenians in this country, namely how they're received by people in the United States, both non-Armenian and Armenian. On this point, I will close, by the way. I think it's possible to divide the sentiment of Armenians who live in this country in what psychologists call a 2-by-2 table. Some Armenians in this country are fairly ethnic, fairly proud of their heritage. Other Armenians are Armenians by name and not very ethnic. About the ethnic Armenians, I think there's an ambivalent attitude about the Armenians coming to this country, particularly the very ethnic Armenians from the Middle East. The ethnic Armenians already here, some welcome Armenian immigrants, welcome them as a new source of life, something to rejuvenate the institutions in this country, add to the memberships of Armenian organizations. However, other ethnic Armenian Americans, I think there's a tendency to reject Armenians from the Middle East coming to this country. I've heard it said explicitly in both the AGBU and in the prelacy that we shouldn't encourage Armenians from the Middle East and the Soviet Union to come here. They should stay there, and perhaps you could see why. The high tide and the let's not drain the Middle East of our people. Non-ethnic Armenians in this country, how do they feel about the newcomers? I think there's the same type of ambivalence. On the one hand, non-ethnic Armenians who are born here or who don't feel Armenian reject newcomers from the Middle East. In New York, I've heard the term boat jobs. People coming to the Armenians coming to this country are boat jobs who embarrass the native born Armenians with their clannishness, their customs, whatever.
Boat jobs? What is boat jobs?
On ships, the old
Yeah, they might get off the 747, but it's not considered overly ethnic.
Greenhorns.
flying
Boat.
B-O-A-T-J-O-B.
Knob.
Can you translate the whole thing? Knob jobs?
Those
Jobs.
they also call them FOBs, fresh off the boat.
Okay, yeah.
Dr. Minasian calls them, says they are called sometimes.
FOBs, fresh off the boat.
I hadn't heard that
I also, that's
On the other hand, there's a tendency among non-ethnic Armenians in this country to see the new immigrants as an interesting group, a group that needs help. I would put myself in this category. Although I was born in this country, I see the Armenians as a challenge to be served. If they want to come to this country, let's help them. Let me close with a statement by a priest at the Armenian diocese who was there, Reverend Kouymjian. A statement he gave me in part of my interview on this topic, which I think applies especially to the Middle East Armenians. And he told me, if you're going to do a demographic study of Armenians in this country, particularly the immigrants, consider this. There are really two Armenian communities in the United States, the natives and the newcomers. They do not resemble each other. The natives are naturally more prosperous. The immigrants are naturally more highly ethnic. The two communities have little interaction with each other. Each has formed its own circles. The relation between the two clusters is not hostile at all, and they are very gradually integrating with time. Yet any description of the characteristics of the Armenian community in the U.S. should treat these two communities quite separately. They are two, not one. Well, thank you.
He's going to talk on a very delicate subject, the immigrants from Soviet Armenia, and I would never have thought of calling her a boat job, but she is herself someone who has come to this country, was not born in this country. She's very active in Watertown, where she's the Armenian Studies Coordinator and is the acting principal of the elementary school. She's an Armenian language and culture teacher. She has taken major responsibilities for curriculum revision there, and she holds degrees from a school, a Bachelor of Science in Education from Armenia, and another an advanced degree from teaching foreign languages from Moscow, USSR, and in Rhode Island, where she received a Master of Arts degree in studying French literature and civilization, and now is on to a doctorate at the School of Education at Boston University. And welcome to you, Ellie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fuchs. I have to talk aloud, I guess. I usually don't speak very low, but I've been asked to talk aloud, so I'll try my best. My topic today is the study of Soviet Armenian immigrants in the United States and their adjustment problems. This present paper's data involves in-depth interviews with some of my friends and relatives here in Boston and Providence. Also, it is based on my personal experience as an immigrant in the United States from Soviet Armenia. Data collection was difficult because of non-existing records about Soviet Armenian immigrants in this country. There aren't agencies that keep track of the Armenian immigrants from Soviet Armenia, and it is difficult to get data from Soviet Armenia itself. It is estimated that 25,000 Soviet Armenians immigrated to the United States between 1970 and 1982. The doors to Armenian immigration may now be closed. The immigration policies are relatively close to those involving Jewish immigration from Soviet Union. Immigration itself is always followed by the resettlement and problems of the adjustment. The process of adjustment is even more complex for the immigrants from Soviet Armenia. Their efforts to cope with daily life are shared with those of coping and interacting within their own ethnic group. This statement needs an explanation. As we all know, at the present time, due to the political situation in the Middle East, the flow of immigration to the United States is considerably higher. The immigrants come from Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Iran, etc., and also from Soviet Armenia. It is very important to take into consideration and understand the socio-historical background of the Armenian immigrants from different countries. The background shapes the people and has impact on their future experiences. Interaction within the dominant American culture may be qualitatively different for Soviet Armenian immigrants than interaction with members of their own group. Therefore, emotional reactions such as discomfort, anxiety, and embarrassment may result from cross-cultural situations. They may heighten the immigrants' awareness of their differences, which can affect their overall satisfaction with life in the new country. The present study includes considerations of both global attitudes and reactions to everyday life and activities by focusing on the impact of social contact and demographic factors. Before we go deeper into these factors, it is important to talk about the background of Soviet Armenians. Most of the immigrants are from urban areas and they tend to be well educated. They're the first and second generations of Armenians who in from 1946 to 1949 returned to Armenia, to Soviet Armenia, their homeland, from Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Bulgaria, France, Iran, Greece, etc. The World War II had just ended, and Soviet Armenia economically was very much exhausted, and Soviet Armenia wasn't ready to accept the immigrants. Here, in these conditions, the adjustment period for the newcomers to Soviet Armenia lasted almost 10 years. For the immigrants of the same ethnic group, of the same nation, but who were different in their political and socio-economical understandings. Finally, as a result of gradual contacts with the local community, social integration was on its way, with the acceptance of the local Soviet Armenian culture and maintenance of their own, the Armenian immigrants finally adjusted in Soviet Armenia. The occupational adjustment of the newcomers was the key, also the key to overall sociocultural adaptation. The immigrants became members of the government of Soviet Armenia. They became well-known scientists, architects, artists, and writers, and all these helped them to develop in their homeland in Soviet Armenia. With the movement of tourism to Soviet Armenia from different countries around the world, and as a result of close relations with Lebanon and Syria, the desire to go back where they came from was awakened. And here we have a whole movement of immigration, and at this time the immigration wasn't back to homeland, but it was to the land where they were born and to different countries around the world. Many people undoubtedly leave home and country because they believe their opportunities will be greater elsewhere. The resettlement of Soviet Armenians in the United States requires adjustment to living within the dominant American culture and to being a member of their community. The newcomers face difficulties learning the language, adjusting to their new acquired jobs, housing, coping with different institutions, schools, medical services, and also they must learn to live in the new culture, dominant American culture, with its social norms and values. For the Soviet Armenians, moving itself is a major disruption in their lives because they arrive to this country or to other countries with only one suitcase and very little money. The minute they enter the country, they seek help. They turn to their ethnic group, and this initial settlement abounds with difficulties because of cross-cultural differences with their own group. What is the reason for such deep differences? I will try to give an explanation. The Soviet Armenians lived in a society that was controlled by the central government. Every aspect of their lives, material, intellectual, and spiritual, was controlled and administered. According to Dickran, the Soviet immigrants generally, quote, obviously never having worked for a private employer, never having paid school tuition or medical fees, having enjoyed cheap public transportation, subsidized cultural events, and job security, face a shockingly different situation from that which they have always known as normal, unquote. Being always controlled, having no freedom to make their own choices, having expectations from the Soviet system lead the newcomers to behave towards the agencies and the members of the ethnic group, of their own ethnic group, in a way which causes problems for the local Armenian community. The Soviet Armenians relate to the local people as they would to the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, as they have no frame of reference for understanding the voluntary sector of American society. This provokes the resentment of their own ethnic group. Therefore, the own ethnic group's contact is very important in immigrants' adjustment. This contact may have two results. As a source, it could be a source of support or a source of isolation. The ethnic group is able to minimize the needs for the change in lifestyle, to provide security and shelter in religious and social activities. The ethnic community may have a positive influence on social adjustment. In short, the ethnic community as support provides a security in process of adjustment of the immigrants in the United States. In Boston area, the Armenian ethnic community acted as a support for the immigrants from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Armenians suffered less awareness of their differences and could find satisfaction with their lives. According to my findings in my during this research, the immigrants, especially the middle-aged people, have less interaction with the members of dominant American culture. This prolongs attachment to the nostalgia for their homeland. This pattern of high contact with the ethnic community, and I call this ethnic community not the American ethnic community, but their own group, the Soviet immigrants, and low contact with the dominant American community isolates this group of immigrants from their, and they try to cope with daily difficulties with the help of each other among themselves. Among the immigrants, there is a group that has low contact with both communities more. As we mentioned above, this is the result of rejection by own community members. I'm sorry if it's shocking, but that's the reality and that's a fact. And I would like to talk about this. This pattern, low contact with both communities, leads to separatism. They become isolated and they spend their time together because of the rejections by the own community. Youth, which is very dangerous, is faced to go out and enjoy the dominant group's life, American life. This could be the first step toward the assimilation, which none of us want. There are other factors that influence the adjustment process in the new culture, such as sex, religious identity, language proficiency, and work experience. As a result of now I will discuss these factors and their influence on the adjustment process itself. Gender. As a result of high ethnic group contact and low dominant group contact, my findings indicate that the female Soviet Armenian suffer less awareness of differences. They experience less tension and anxiety in everyday life. Other people, female or male, suffer more from loneliness. Older people, female or male, suffer more from loneliness and homesickness. Unable to learn the dominant language, they can't be in contact with the dominant culture as well as with their own ethnic group. Younger immigrants, male and female, adjust more easily because of their capability to learn a new language and also their flexibility. This is the acceptance of the new values of both the dominant and the own ethnic groups for this group, young group. Work experiences. Work experience and educational background play a great role in the process of adjustment. More educated they are with higher social status, less difficulties they face in adjustment of the new life conditions. According to my findings, this group of Armenian immigrants are accepted by the local ethnic community. Probably I am one of them. This is the group that could be described as the one with high contact with both communities. This indicates the acceptance of the new American culture, of the new ethnic culture, and the maintenance of the native one that they brought with them from Soviet Armenia. The findings indicate that middle-class Americans, immigrants, are well established. They work hard and are appreciated at their work environment. For this reason, they feel less differences in the new culture, American culture. Therefore, they face more difficulties with their own ethnic group because they hold on strongly to their values and are not flexible in accepting the new ethnic values. Their occupational adjustment, successful employment, restore the immigrants' self-esteem and give them the opportunity to learn the language. Language proficiency. Language proficiency is very important in the adjustment process of the newcomers, especially from Soviet Armenia. Learning the language is overall key to this adjustment, the key to better understanding the norms, the values of the new culture, American culture. Not knowing the language may lead to misunderstandings and anxiety. Language difficulties clearly mark immigrants as members of an ethnic or national group, calling attention to their differences. Language difficulties limit their social interaction with Americans, and as a result, the immigrants depend on others and they cannot easily understand their environment. These all problems force them to learn the language as soon as possible. In conclusion, well, I'm not concluding, I'm just concluding these patterns that are from Soviet Armenians.
You have a total of 10 minutes.
In conclusion, the group of immigrants with high contact with ethnic group and high contact with dominant group are integrated Soviet Armenians. They have satisfaction with their new life, for they are able to establish friendly relationships with groups, their own ethnic group, and with the dominant American group. Low-class immigrants with low contact with their own ethnic group and low contact with the dominant group are the less adjusted group. They are stereotyped and suffer more the awareness of the differences. They make few changes in their lifestyle or attitudes except those necessary to accommodate local norms. The process of adjustment is in direct interaction with the time. Time leads to a decrease in stereotyping and difficulties in everyday life, and an increase of acceptance of cultural norms and values of all sides, dominant culture, local ethnic groups' culture, and the immigrants' own culture. The immigration from Soviet Armenia is considered a non-patriotic act by diasporian Armenian ethnic community. Therefore, one should not forget that to immigrate, to start a new life, is the individual's decision. To cheer you a little up, I would like to read I have the summary of a story that I read and tried to analyze myself. And after reading this story to you, probably I will make you think and us all think together and see what the story tells us. Once upon a time, I will just give you the summary. This is a story by, I'll talk about the author later. Once upon a time, in fact it was on a Tuesday, the bear stood at the edge of a great forest and gazed up at the sky. He saw a flock of geese flying south. Then he gazed up at the trees. The leaves had turned all yellow and brown. He knew it was time to go into a cave and hibernate. And that was just what he did. Not long afterward, in fact it was on a Wednesday, men came with charts and maps, with saws and tractors, and they worked, and finally they built a great big huge factory right over the top of the sleeping bear's cave. The factory operated all through the cold winter, and then it was spring again. The bear woke, stood up, looked around. His eyes popped wide apart. Where was the forest? Where were the trees and the flowers? Where was he? Things looked strange. But we do. We know where he was. He was right in the middle of the busy factory. Just then a man came out of the door. "Hey you, get back to work." "I'm the foreman and I will report you for not working," said the man. The bear said, "I do not work here, I am a bear." "Don't try to fool me," said the man. "You are not a bear, you are a silly man who needs to shave and wears a fur coat." "I'm going to take you to the general manager." The general manager looked at him and said, "You are not a bear, you're a silly man that needs a shave and wears a fur coat. I'm going to take you to the third vice president." The bear said, "I'm sorry to hear you say that. I'm a bear." And so on. They took the bear to the second vice president, to the first vice president, to the president, and it was the same thing, that he is not a bear and he is a silly man who needs a shave and wears a fur coat. Finally, they all decided to punish the bear. They all got into the president's car and took the bear to the zoo. Is he a bear?" the president asked the zoo bears. The zoo bear said, "No, he isn't a bear, because if he were a bear, he would be with us inside the cage." A little zoo bear said, "I know who he is. He's a silly man who needs a shave and wears a fur coat." The poor bear was repeating, "I'm a bear." And so they all went to the circus. The circus bear said that he is not a bear because he was not riding a bicycle with them. They went back to the factory where he started working on a big machine. One day the factory closed down, the workers went home. The bear walked alone behind them and had no place to go. As he walked alone, he looked up at the sky and saw the flock of geese flying south. He remembered it was time to hibernate. He was just about to go into the cave when he stopped and said, "But I can't, I'm not a bear. I'm a silly man who needs a shave and wears a fur coat." So winter came. He was shivering because he did not know what a silly man who needed a shave and wore a fur coat would do if he were freezing to death in the snow. What does it mean? What does this story mean? Some readers found it simply delightful, others see it as satire on business, still others think it is an existential cartoon story upon the human situation, and still others think it is a symbolization of the story upon human situation, the symbolization of the struggle between conformity and the individual, between self and the new demands of the complex society. Let us all think about it, and to finish my paper, I have few more lines to read to you. Anya Peterson Royce, in her book Ethnic Identity that I'm studying now, and it is an excellent book, writes, "It is true that contact with groups and individuals who are perceived as different from oneself is necessary in order to make one's ethnic identity relevant. Then the context and process of immigration is a prime contributor to ethnicity. At this present time, there is an ethnic revitalization movement in the American Armenian community. More militant movement of ethnic nationalism is influenced by the immigrants who tend never give up their own identity. Let the Soviet immigrants have their part in this movement."
You'll be back. You'll come back because there are a lot of questions for you. What to make of these four papers, and is there a unity to them? Is there something that can be learned about them collectively? Is there a tension among them? I'm not sure that there is, and I don't want to force it. I find there is one storyline in the 4 papers, and that is that there is a sense here of a group that has never achieved quite the size and the unity to have as much political clout as it would like to have with respect to the great issue of the restoration of a nation for Armenia. There is a sense of ongoing struggle, even though the group is disproportionately successful. There is, to start at the very bottom line, one might say, an uncertainty as to what the numbers are, an uncertainty as to what the depth of the commitment of those hypothetical numbers are. There is a sense of uncertainty as to whether the divisions that exist within the Armenian American community, whether based on recent immigration versus older patterns of settlement versus, or on Soviet Armenian immigrants versus other Armenian immigrants, or based on religious lines, whether those can be overcome sufficiently to bring about that sense of unity, that sense of strength. There is in the story, in the really very fascinating and moving story of the capitulation of MGM, a kind of a symbolic example or illustration of that. Although I would be quick to point out that in the 1930s, Hollywood capitulated to just about everybody. They would not make a movie on racism, on anti-Semitism, on anything that might offend anybody. And I am struck by Thalberg's defense up to the last moment that MGM go ahead with this great film. One is struck finally by, and I will close, this juxtaposition of the sense of struggle and division as against the sense of, which I'm sure was discussed at length in this conference previously, the sense of extraordinary, of disproportionate creative action of all kinds, intellectual, artistic, of all kinds, and communal activity. And it may be that we're dealing here with the combination of numbers not being quite large enough and certain kinds of divisions being too serious, too important, not yet overcome, so that there's not sufficient unity. One can't help but make the contrast here, as is often done, with the Jewish American community. The numbers are greater, about 3 million, so it's 6 times the number. The experience is very similar in so many ways. And of course the congruence, the juxtaposition here one sees at this conference. American Jews who are so interested in the experience of the Armenians. The fact that Franz Werfel wrote this great novel, did it partly out of his own Jewish experience. And yet, in the context here, one has to say that 500,000, 500,000 may not be enough to get enough clout, and that the divisions which exist are more serious than the divisions that exist or have ever existed, really, in the Jewish community in the United States, with the exception of this business of the old versus new immigrants. That has always existed. The people who have been around a long time seem to be nervous about the folks who are coming in, even when they want to help them and try them. They are nervous about their newness, their greenness, they're just seeming to be out of sorts with the American way of life. Anyway, these are my random comments, trying to pull some things together out of 4 papers on 4 quite different subjects. So, it's up to you now to pull it all together more than I have done, and for the panel to do so. Yes, sir.
Referring to the last 2 speakers, I cannot fail but call attention to a gracious lady who is in our presence, through whose efforts the old quota system, where Armenians were around only 100 people here in America, And through her efforts and her husband's efforts, we were able to get through Kennedy and others and change the code system. I'm referring to Mrs. Armenian. I want her to know that our community, she was the spark plug that started the changes in immigration. If I may go one further to the first speaker, if I may make a speech, please, instead of a question, I have with me a document, the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia. The letter is written February 1920 to Armenian Student Association at the time, who was promoting Armenian independence. And I want to get just one section, that Armenia will be liberated is no longer a debatable question. The end towards which we must all now strive is to secure reasonable boundaries for the Armenian state. And in my opinion, no arrangement is reasonable that does not bring Armenia down to the Mediterranean coast. Not only does the vital interest of Armenia demand that Armenia should have an outlet on the Mediterranean, but also the interest of the aiding power of Armenia would suggest the advisability of having a means of access to her through the Levant, written by the chairman of the American Committee for Independence of Armenia, James W. Gerard. It's a document.
It's very interesting.
Accidentally came across when I was searching for something else.
Do you want to comment, Mr. Aftandilian?
Well, I think the document was very much in line with the ideology of the committee, because the ideology is very much for the independence movement as opposed to the mandate. And also, it dealt with large territorial claims. Though we have to criticize the committee in one respect, that once the growth of isolationism came, that the committee still believed that the United States would deliver on its promises. And the committee should have taken note of the fact that because the League of Nations was defeated first time in November of 1919, that the committee had to adjust its policy somewhat. So I think it reflects both the ideology of the committee, but also some of the shortcomings that they faced.
I want to point out that the list on the side has all the members, major members of the governors spoken. I counted 19 governors. And at the top of the list is, of course, Charles Evans Hugh, and then Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the one who made it
Sabotage.
Who sabotaged it.
Yeah. Well, it's a very instructive letter. That issue, I think you really must have a strong case study on that. What happened to that? Because today one has to believe that given the emphasis on human rights, given the great interest in the Congress in human rights, given the willingness of the United States to commit itself overseas, but there was an example of self-determination. What did it mean? It was rhetoric, because the USA really didn't want to be involved.
I want to address the same question to Mr. Takooshian. Some years ago, we were faced with the same problem of trying to find a number of Armenians in various way of life and so on. And one thing that we've used very successfully is the name. 95 to 98% Armenian end with IAN. And I believe that, regardless where they come from, the immigration has the names of people coming to this country. I wonder if somebody would just go through and pick up the IANs, and you'll find a much better statistics, really, than any place else. With one exception of Armenia, there are also some IANs that are not Armenians. But I would say that that is probably the one which is, for example, years ago we tried to prepare a list of Armenian scientists in this country and do those statistical studies on that. So who is who in America? Going through the pages and we've got almost 1,500 IANs. usually the Persian INs have a religious name. Like, for example, Kouymjian. Okay, it's an IN, but the first name is Muhammad. So that somebody that knows Persian can very easily deduct that. And I would say that this may not be very accurate, but at least 90 to 95%.
Mr. Takooshian.
Yes, Justice, it's an intriguing idea, and I'd like to compare notes with you after, if I may.
Can I make one more comment?
Wait, but on this issue?
Yes.
On the names, okay.
At one time, some Armenian group here in Boston decided to have all the names in the telephone directory, and they ended up with Guardian Safe Company as part of the Armenian.
Yes, that lady and then you. Yes.
I don't know if the Armenian, if this happened to the Armenian music or not, but at Ellis Island, so many Arab names got changed that we can't tell the Kellys from the Cohen and from the Arabs. I mean, there's a Kelly Arab, and there's a Shannon Arab, and there's a McMurray Arab, and so on. Simply because the officials, particularly in the 20th century, this is the period I'm addressing myself to, were really inexperienced people, unfamiliar with the foreign countries from which the people came, harassed and crowded by a lot of people, so they just wrote down anything. One Arab tells the story, whose name is Ellis, said, my father was asked what his name was, and he went like this, and I thought it was Ellis Island, and wrote the name Ellis on it.
I had a question for Professor Minasian about Musa. I'm curious to know how public a lot of these diplomatic machinations that were going on were. How aware was the American Armenian community of the Turkish propaganda, of the machinations of the Turkish embassy to stop them, and what efforts did they put forth against it?
The Armenian press was aware of it, and they had access to the documents, but MGM has the most thorough, definitive collection that you won't find anywhere else, and by and large they knew about the Turkish pressure and so forth, but the problem here was the community was weak for the simple reason it was factionalized, and we just had too many spokesmen who had their captive audiences, and and it didn't work. But I was informed when I went to MGM in 1981 that I was the first and only person who ever indicated any interest in the Musa Dagh file.
One further question: to what extent
Yes.
Turkish threats were realistic?
Oh, they were very realistic.
I mean, to what power?
I think I mentioned France let the State Department know, the Muslim, the Balkan countries, Greece, etc., that it wasn't just MGM films that would be banned, it would be all American motion pictures, and that's something those studios couldn't deal with because a good part of their market was in Europe in particular. See, that was the factor that ended the Musa Dagh idea. And by the way, of course, this story goes on because the closest it came to a full-fledged Gone with the Wind production, if I may use that expression, was on the Pandro Berman, one of the top producers in Hollywood in the 60s. And he had the location sites all ready to go. He had his crews ready. Guy Green was going to be director, etc. The cast was just about ready to be selected, and it started all over again. And by the time John Kirkjian bought the rights, $1,800,000 had been expended. And it was all down the tubes.
Yes, Rob.
I wanted to comment on two of the papers that got all four of them very interesting. On the new immigrants, I thought those were very instructive. But two questions I had. One was about the immigrants from the Middle East. I wanted to tell. You said, I thought you said something about that there weren't too many tensions between the newcomers and the older group, or that they were relatively well accepted. And that seems to jar with the impression, not that I've done any research on this, there's a great deal of hostility. In fact, people are saying that the new division in the community is not a political division, or that's still there. But now, in addition, is the generational thing between the newcomers and the older. Really sort of deep hostility. I want to ask you about that. And then I want to ask Mrs. Andreassian, her interest in me. She said about that the Soviet Armenians, many of them felt rejection. And then you didn't specify that, and I just and I thought that was very sad and very intriguing, and I wondered if you would give us some examples of those areas in which they seem to be rejected by the older community.
I didn't discuss that thoroughly in my paper because the Soviet Armenian immigrants are comparatively better accepted here than in California. This rejection and isolation is more frequent and found in California, Los Angeles. And
Why is that?
Did you discuss that? I mean,
well, I mentioned in my paper the difference of understanding and difference of lifestyle, and both sides probably don't want to change and accept each other, and takes time. I have friends in California. I made a phone call. By the way, 25,000 Soviet Armenian immigrants. I got the number from California, from the newcomers, and they think that the situation is very sad there, very much, because there are different groups. They are Beiruti Armenians, they are native Armenians, they are Armenians from Iran, they are Armenians from Armenia, and they all they're not tolerant, and they don't want to. Probably we need education. They don't want to accept each other, and they don't want to praise or evaluate each other's values. Probably we need the education on this domain to educate our different ethnic groups to be more tolerant and understand each other.
I don't want to monopolize this, but what would you say was the singular feature of, say, the Soviet Armenians, say, in California, which is the most difficult for the other groups to accept?
I would like to mention that this is especially the low-class Soviet Armenians in California. It's not secret, and most of them, when they come first, they are on welfare, and this is kind of not acceptable for the native American Armenians and Armenians from Beirut. But I think one should not forget that they all were newcomers. I mean, the American Armenians system, and they couldn't get any help, so they had to work right from the first day. I blame that this class of Soviet Armenians in Los Angeles, but on the other hand, I think that we need, if they need help, then they should get help, and this is not a shame, because after a while they start working and they build up their home and their life, and they are very much active now in social life.
Okay. Now, you wanted to comment on this point, didn't you? And did you want to comment on this point or the previous point? Yeah. All right. Let's stick with this point for a minute, and then you wanted to comment on this point too. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think the analysis is absolutely correct. The major point is the one of welfare. We have to analyze that welfare question very carefully, because it's one that's devastating our community and shouldn't be. Remember, there is a distinct difference between an immigrant who comes from the Soviet Union and an immigrant who comes from the Middle East. The basic difference is the attitude of the United States government towards that immigrant. An immigrant from the Soviet Union is immediately given refugee status. With refugee status, it immediately qualifies the immigrant to go on welfare instantly and get on to the American dole. Our government encourages that policy, and it's good that they encourage people using welfare, because welfare is legislated with our dollars to help people who need welfare, and they should make use of it maximally. Then, what does that present within our context? Exactly what you said. This old idea by the assimilated Armenian that there is something shameful, amot, about getting welfare. Why? Particularly in California, it's not so simple. In California, it's because the Armenians have assimilated so well to the superior American culture that they have had reinforced and intensified a racism which is very strong toward Chicanos and blacks, who are the major visible elements of welfare, even though they are clearly the minority people, because it's whites who are more on welfare than colored people and colored Chicanos and blacks. So this is an insidious thing that enters into our community and is fueled out of our ignorance towards a system which is basically created by the American government's policy. I don't mean to say that the policy is designed to create the problem in the Armenian community, but it is the policy of the government that allows this division to occur. And we should be aware of that, and we, those of us that have grown up in this country, when we judge too quickly what it's all about. And who can help in this problem? Well, our press might help us a little bit by having some cogent analysis of this whole question, rather than highlighting the fact that some people who come from a different system behave the way they've always known how to behave.
Fascinating. Harold.
I know that in Canada there's quite a bit of friction between the Armenian communities there. Mr. Vidukian was unfortunately the victim of it. Churches relocating, almost open hostility. I don't see the same thing happening though in New York City, although I understand it happens in California. I think the political difference between the two Armenians is greater than the difference between the newcomers and the natives.
On this point, anybody want to be on this point, and before we switch?
A related point.
Related point.
I want to ask Mrs. Andreassian, is it possible to tell whether the majority of immigrants from the Soviet Union today are those who first immigrated to the Soviet Union from other countries and became disappointed with the political realities there, or whether that's not necessarily
Yes,
so?
yes, 90%
Came from elsewhere.
came from elsewhere to Armenia and then went back to the old regime or system that they preferred, probably.
Are those things
And
Are you among them?
yes, I'm one of them. But I'm the second generation, but don't forget that the conversation at home was all the time about the Beirut or about Syria or about France, and that was all that the second generation heard at home. So when you see second generation leaving the country, the homeland, and coming, say, to the United States, that's partially because of the influence of parents and their understandings. And if you ask me that should we encourage the immigration from Soviet Armenia, if you ask my own opinion, I think no, we should stay there. Probably suffer more, but we should stay there. But once we're here, but once we're here, once they are here, they need help. Then I think that the native community and the other ethnic Armenian, the other groups should help them.
The moderator yesterday afternoon used the word disillusion for Armenians who had gone to Soviet Armenia after World War II and then gotten out. Would you use that word?
Yes.
Well, okay, we've got you haven't spoken yet, you haven't spoken yet, and you haven't. Those three, you've got to, I'll get back if there's time. We've got 5 more minutes. Go ahead, sir.
I just wanted to ask a question about the language problem between the Eastern and Western Armenians, and whether in a place like Los Angeles, where we've been trying to start schools to teach the children Armenian, what implications this will have as to what dialect of Armenian we have to teach the children in the schools, and whether we have to have separate schools and thus separate communities of Eastern and Western Armenian speakers.
I think it would be ideal if we had both languages in the same school instead of separating the schools. That will be another separatism, you know, on the top of it, you know.
All right, these two gentlemen have not yet spoken. One in the back, and then the Archbishop. Yes. Yeah.
Question.
Loud, please.
Will Ellie please explain whether or not there has been an attempt on the part of these Armenians in Soviet Armenia to establish within their culture community any kind of organization that reaches out in an organized fashion to the stabilized Armenian community? And on the other hand, is there any effort in the past of Armenian organizations to reach out to them?
Very good question. Have you got it, Ellie?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have the answer. When I first came to this country, it was Providence, because my husband's relatives all lived in Providence, and they were the ones who came to Armenia, visited us, and suggested to come and live here with them. So we had to go to Providence. I lived in Providence for 6 years. My husband and I, we founded there an Armenian philanthropic society, Urartu Society, and still exists. It exists, that society, in Providence, and my husband is the president. And his goal is to bring everybody together and to bring out these isolated Soviet Armenians into the large community. And we often organize their cultural gatherings and invite all their hires and community members, and whenever there are other cultural events organized by different churches or organizations, we try to convince them, to help them to go there and participate. And this helped probably because the tension is less now in Providence. I don't see any tension here myself, because probably I am accepted by the native Armenians here and by other, partially probably by other groups. Probably I don't see any tension here, but I have friends and relatives here, and they are all well adjusted in Boston area.
We have 2 minutes left for 2 questions, so go ahead. You
take first.
Suppose we'll speak last.
You like to speak last? But I will speak after you.
I'm struck that this Andreassian has managed to be on both sides of the Soviet Armenians, or at least native and Soviet Armenians. You say that you now believe that Soviet Armenians should stay in Soviet Armenia.
Yes.
Do you think that someone should have stopped you from coming to this country?
I can't say that, because we all know that we have all rights, that's human rights, that's basic for everybody, and this is individual's own decision to leave the country and settle wherever he wants to. But I think should be more propaganda, and it's partially of Soviet system's fault too, because the doors are closed. My husband always says that if he saw America, he wouldn't come to America. He would stay in Soviet Armenia. But he didn't see, because of cultural differences, because of patriotic probably feelings, and because that the life is not easy. Everywhere life is difficult, but the difficulties are different. In Armenia, the difficulties is more or less financial, and in this country there aren't any, if you work hard, no financial difficulties, but in this case we have the affective domain that suffers a lot.
Do you agree with your husband?
Yes.
You do. In the immigrant experience, many times men do say that and women don't.
Yeah.
Many times. Why? Because the older cultural life is easier for men. Their systems of authority and control, even when they are living in a vast prison. Whereas this is, as the immigrants used to say, is a woman's country. The immigrants would say. Okay, now we have one last comment, and we've got to go to a question. Going to be a question or a comment?
Question, and later on Mr. Takooshian.
How much later on?
For 2 minutes. Now, I've got a question first from Mrs. Andreassian. You mentioned several times low class and middle class. In what terms do you call them middle? In Soviet terms or American terms? And if it's simply economical, what do you mean? I mean, they come with more money?
No, American terms. When they American terms, and having into consideration their educational background.
Educational level, thank you. And I would like to add that Miss Mrs. Andreassian's subject is so fascinating that it requires more expanding and deepening, and it will be a beautiful case study not only for us, but also as to compare the psychology and attitude with regard to their own culture in the Soviet Union, not only in Armenia but elsewhere also in this country. Because this description of the two societies and just black and white is not adequate enough. Because I have heard young people, educated people in Armenia who know what their system is and who know what the American system is, they prefer to remain there. I met young people and Soviet immigrants here after seeing around, and they give very good logical reasons why they would like to be back in the Soviet Union. And others, of course, are very happy. Now, I want to come back to Mr. Takooshian. First of all, I find in your references one article which is...
Please, go ahead, please.
One article which is very important and you have missed. That is Ara Avakyan's article in Ararat magazine, which really entirely is devoted to the counting of the Armenian community in the United States. Now, let me add two things. In St. James Church neighborhood, there is a large department store in Los Angeles. For a period after the Soviet immigrants, a poster was put with red letters, fairly large, "Armenians are not welcome." Now, this sort of exposition explains why the native Armenians feel the way they feel towards Soviet immigrants. But let me go back to Takooshian. First of all, you made 5 different definitions of the citizenship question, or rather of the definition of Armenian language, religious, that's understandable, but what do you mean national definition? Because we have got to understand that the word nation is understood in Western Europe and the United States in an entirely different sense. Because in the Near Eastern countries, Turkey and Syria and so on, it doesn't make difference what citizen you are, where you have lived. It means what is your parentage and descendants. Descendants determines a person's status and not the citizenship.
All right, let's see. What did you mean by it?
Exactly what you mean. Nationality refers to ancestry in the sociologist's view, as opposed to statehood or country of citizenship. So an Armenian living in Turkey, nationality-wise, would be an Armenian.
Yeah.
State-wise in Turkey.
So, in other, you meant in the Near Eastern sense.
In the Near Eastern sense of nationality.
I would like to answer the political definition. Just citizens. If a citizen of Syria, when he comes, that comes with him. I mean, his Syrian citizenship will come with him, and in Western Europe, in this country, they usually disregard that problem. Now, coming to the how to count.
This is the last one.
Yeah, the last one. How to count our community in this country. Now, first of all, because I have been in charge of our diocese, since that time I've been interested in this problem. The most concise and certain way is to count the registered membership of the parishes. That's very easy. Then you expand that into the address list of the parishes. Address list and other address lists. Thirdly, the question of unchurched people. You have got to multiply this number you arrived at by certain numbers, and that's a guesswork, of unchurched people who are not on these ordinarily used addresses of parishes and so on. Then there comes the Armenians who are connected with non-Armenian churches and therefore would not enter into the address list of each parish. They are a separate category. And
you know what? I'm embarrassed. I am late for a meeting So if you all want to continue to
I finished.
you can, but you have to take over for me. I'm just so embarrassed. Okay, you are. Well, you've got certainly your points are. Your last point is superb, and that article is one you've got to track down. I remind you again that the information you have available for some of us on a mimeograph sheet, I certainly would like one, to prove to you that all of us are becoming more Americanized all the time, even though we may not like it. Although we started 20 minutes...
I don't like it. I'm multicultural myself.
Right. Although we started 20 minutes late, we're going to finish only about 14 minutes late, so we're getting more fetishistic about time, too. I think the panel is fascinating. I think this particular aspect of the panel, this particular concern, is the more contemporary concern of why is it that there should be tension among Armenians, not even based on ideology, not based on religion, not based on any idea at all, but based on the fact that these newcomers, particularly in Los Angeles, are poorer, on welfare, and are somehow an embarrassment to the older settled communities. It is an issue that American immigrant ethnic communities have faced before. It is one that is always true. The people who are established are embarrassed by newcomers who seem to raise in the general mind the possibility that they are somehow less capable of becoming good Americans, or that they are somehow less worthy, or somehow more difficult to deal with. It's a common American experience. Again, the Jewish experience was great embarrassment on the part of the German Jews who were settled about the Russian Jews. Terrible embarrassment, wanted to distance themselves from them. And this was the turn of the century experience. Eventually, they decided they could not distance themselves. The other Americans would always say they're all Armenians, all Jews. And so they had to get together. And so the older, established, settled, and respectable ethnic communities had to take on responsibility for the newcomers who needed their help. And probably that is going to happen even in that land of Sodom and Gomorrah, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Professor Fuchs. If I may take a moment again with a few important announcements, I'd like to remind the participants that I am collecting, I do have Ed's paper, I would like to have it for
Keep in mind the double theme of Armenians and America. We did not think just in terms of how Armenians or any other ethnic group came to this country, adjusted to the altered circumstances, and then, to a greater or a lesser extent, lost some of their previous cultural characteristics. We also attempted to see how the Armenians, in their own way, had had an influence on American life. There doesn't seem much point in a mechanical computation. How many Armenian lawyers are there, for example? Since then, it would be a question of American law and not Armenian. We thought it would be much more interesting to discuss three artists of Armenian descent who worked in America and gained fame as American artists. Now, I realize that it's usually easier to frame questions than to provide answers. But we did wonder to what extent, for example, Alan Hovhaness not only used Armenian themes, but contributed something of his Armenianness to the mainstream of modern music. William Saroyan was a writer of international renown. His Armenian self-awareness is self-evident. But will his influence on contemporary American writers be considered an Armenian influence? Are such labels as American, Armenian, very relevant for the understanding of Achille Gorky? I don't know. We therefore look forward to the next three papers and to a vigorous debate thereafter. Our first speaker this afternoon is Sahan Arzruni from New York City. A graduate of the Juilliard School of Music, Mr. Arzruni has gained a nationwide reputation as a pianist, but he's also lectured and written on the history of music and on its interpretation. He's recorded an anthology of Armenian piano music and has a particular interest in the work of Alan Hovhaness. Although Mr. Arzruni is perhaps known to more people because of his earlier association with Victor Borge, among the Conoscenti, his own reputation is secure. We therefore welcome Sahan Arzruni to address us on his theme, Alan Hovhaness, the Armenian wellspring of his music. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Alan Hovhaness is a musician who believes in the possibility of attaining insight into mysteries beyond ordinary human knowledge. Into areas that are beyond the contingent in human experience, but not beyond all human knowledge. Hovhaness perceives the role of music to be a catalyst between the physical world and a metaphysical cosmos. Alan Hovhaness, an alias for Alan Vanes Chakmakjian, was born in Somerville, Massachusetts on March 8, 1911. His father, a professor of chemistry, was Armenian, and his mother was Scottish. Alan Hovhaness reveals that music kept running through my head long before he received formal instructions. He learned to improvise on the piano before he made a composition writing a short organ piece on an 11-line staff which his mother refused to play on the family's small harmonium. This is interesting because the 11-line staff is the precursor of the modern-day 5-line staff. Of course, Mr. Hovhaness didn't know anything about that. I gave up music until I was 7 years old, he says. At that time, I composed on regular staff. But at night, when I was supposed to be asleep, I made another notation which I could see in the dark. This system of writing music, without being able to see it, resembled a vocal Armenian notation of around the 1820 period, which I learned later. Of course, this is, Mr. Hovhaness is alluding to the system of writing Armenian church music, which was invented by Baba Hampartum in 1806. But of course, Mr. Hovhaness had no idea at the age of 7 about this system also. By then, his family had moved to Arlington, a suburb of Boston, where Alan was raised and received his preliminary academic education at its public schools and at Arlington High School. When he was 9, he began taking piano lessons from Adelaide Proctor, who encouraged him to compose. Alan completed 2 operas, as well as numerous shorter piano compositions by the time he was 13 years old. In 1929, piano study took place with Henry Gebhardt, again in Boston. When Hovhaness graduated from the high school that year, he entered Tufts University, where he remained a year and a half. In 1932, on a scholarship, he was admitted to the New England Conservatory. During the next 2 years, he studied composition there with Frederick Converse. An important influence in his early life was the music of Komidas. Having become interested in Armenian music through Komidas, Hovhaness proceeded to learn what he could about Armenia, its background and its music, which in turn brought about an interest in the music and culture of other Eastern countries. When he was 17, Hovhaness completed writing several successful compositions. These included a piano quintet, a short word for violin and piano called Aurore, a Christmas song called Watchman, Tell Us of the Night for solo bass, chorus, and organ. A symphony in 1933 was performed by the New England Conservatory and received the Samuel Endicott Prize. He withdrew the symphony soon thereafter. What officially became Symphony No. 1 was subtitled Exile and was written in 1936 and introduced on May 26, 1939 in England in a performance by the BBC Symphony conducted by Leslie Heward. Earlier, in 1935, Hovhaness completed, among other works, Missa Brevis for bass, chorus, strings, and organ, Sonata Ricercare for piano, Fantasy, again for piano, and Prelude and Fugue for oboe and bassoon. His string quartet No. 1 came in 1936. Some of these works were largely influenced by Bartók, but the invasion of the East had also begun, even if tentatively. For example, in Laila, he used a Persian text. In Two Ghazals, he used a Persian lyrical love poem form. Between 1940 and 47, Hovhaness earned his living in Boston by teaching, working as piano accompanist, and as organist at the Armenian Church of St. James in Watertown. Playing Armenian liturgical music with its monodic and modal style further stirred his interest in the land and music of his father's birth. A second major influence about this time was attending a performance in Boston by Uday Shankar and his company of Indian musicians and dancers, which opened up for Hovhaness the world of Indian music and culture. To penetrate more deeply in the world of the East, Hovhaness began mastering the Armenian language and Armenian music, as well as the music of other Eastern countries. At the same time, he delved into this in the East made him satisfied with the kind of music he had been writing thus far. Hovhaness destroyed most of them, stuff that he had written before 1940. That included several hundred compositions, his first 7 symphonies, 5 string quartets, some operas, sonatas, and sundry piano works. Experiencing a musical rebirth, he began developing a style combining important elements of Eastern music with Western materials and resources. His melodies began simulating the improvisational character of Armenian cantallations. He adopted Eastern modes and rhythmic practices. To advance himself technically, Hovhaness went on a scholarship to the Berkshire Music Center at Tanglewood, Massachusetts during the summer of 1942 to study composition with Bohuslav Martini. I believe it is important to discuss here the conceptual differences between Western and Eastern music. All music attempts to communicate ideas, feelings, and moods on a level that is not quite possible through words and images. I would say that it is the method of communication that is different between the Eastern and the Western. In the West, we experience emotional culmination through dramatic climaxes. In the East, the same emotional culmination is achieved through melodies spiraling toward a point of silence. With this frame of reference in mind, the West resorts to melodic scales such as major and minor that have a distinct harmonic directionality with a built-in tension and relaxation. Whereas in the East, there are modes, such as ragas and maqamat, that are devoid of harmonic implications and therefore patterns of tension and relaxation. In the West, the concept of rhythm is confined to clearly defined metric divisions, such as 2, 3, or 4 beats to a measure, whereas in the East, there are no such metric regularities, but elaborate patterns that provide an underlying order. Clearly and undisputably, the Armenian music belongs to the Eastern tradition, the Armenian traditional music, that is. In 1945, the Eastern influence on Hovhaness' music became a pervading presence. For the first time in 1943, he utilized Armenian folk songs in his compositions. He heard from Yenov der Hagopian in 1943 a set of folk songs from the district of Van, which Alan Hovhaness decided to arrange for piano, using Gomidas as his model in those arrangements. I would like to play some of them for you to give you an idea what they sound like. I think this piano has been in a war and has lost it. Not only we have black and white keys, we have brown keys. That's something new. These are some of them. The arrangement of those compositions has been the most difficult thing he has done in his life. To keep it as simple as possible, the way Gomidas has done it. As I said before, in 1943, the 12 Armenian folk songs for piano were written, and they were based on Armenian mountain village melodies from the district of Van. Armenian rhapsodies for strings written in 1944-45 used Armenian dance tunes and an Armenian Dagh. The first of these rhapsodies was introduced in Boston under the composer's direction on February 4, 1944. On the same program was also heard Musa, a concerto for piano and orchestra, in which aleatory processes were used for the first time. In this procedure, the composer assigns different short melodic patterns with pitches and rhythms specified to several parts, with instructions that each player execute the passage over and over at his own speed without coordination with the rest of the ensemble. Here the sounds of Eastern instruments were reproduced on Western instruments, melodies were decorated with fanciful figurations, chordal harmonies were danced with, and climaxes were achieved, as I said before, by melodies spiraling toward a point of silence, all in the Eastern manner. When Hovhaness made his debut in New York on June 17, 1945, in an all-Hovhaness program at the invitation of the Arts Committee of the Armenian Student Association of America, he performed the two Armenian rhapsodies, the Lusadzak and Vara, which is a monastery in Armenia, for violin and piano, and Kouymjian Hayrik for trumpet and strings, Kouymjian Hayrik being a heroic Armenian priest. In 1945, Alan composed Mir for two pianos, named after an Armenian fire god. Hovhaness again used the Eastern method of repetitive tones to achieve tension, the modal melodies and arabesque figurations over a cantus firmus. Anahit, a fantasy for flute, English horn, trumpet, timpani, percussion and strings, was inspired by the goddess of the pre-Christian Armenia. In 1949, Hovhaness contributed a score to his first ballet, Is There Survival?, whose scenario was based on the exploits of King Vahakan, the legendary Armenian warrior king. It was produced in 1950 with choreography by Jan Keen. Eastern history, geography, legends continued to fascinate Hovhaness in the 1950s, while he was further refining and perfecting his personalized Eastern-oriented idiom. Thus, his idiom developed to encompass the styles of India, China, Japan, and Korea, and eventually Hovhaness molded it into a musical language that is his own. During a recent conversation, I asked Hovhaness to articulate his thoughts about music and its place in today's world. Here is what he said in part. It has always been my idea that music is a force to join heaven and earth, or the sphere of spirits with the spirit of our particular dimension, which we live in this particular carnation to which we return many times. Actually, we live in both worlds, but we aren't aware of the other world perhaps. But music can make us aware of it and make us feel it. And in that case, music serves this joining of heaven and earth. Actually, the universe, which interpenetrates the physical universe we call heaven, it may be hell too, has both qualities. I try to imitate the feelings of nature, the feelings of animals, the feelings of the soul, rather than the feelings of industry which is a thing of this moment, and it is very brittle and may disappear off the face of the earth any moment. Anyway, this is the thing, I think, that is causing sickness in the mind, in the spirit, because we are advanced in science, but we are not scientific in regard to the effects of science. Because it's convenient, it's marvelous, very clever, but we are destroying ourselves. I think the arts must show something different, a new direction into more cosmic consciousness. I don't belong to all centuries, to all time. I do not believe that there is such a thing as time in cosmos. There are cycles, and they repeat. The only thing an artist can do is to rise above his time and be of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately for us, Mr. Arzruni has to leave fairly soon. I mean, he is traveling abroad tonight. We had originally planned that the discussion would encompass all the presentations at the end of the session. But in view of Mr. Arzruni's planned departure, I would like now to open the floor to queries and questions for the next 10 minutes or so. Now, I see a hand raised here.
Sure.
Mr. Arzruni, yes. You may be interested to know that Hovhaness
yes.
used to meet with Yenofter Hakokian and a fellow by name is Sam Haidostian who played sounds.
Right.
At my brother Lemyal Amirin, who is now in Palo Alto, who had open house every Friday. And these people used to come down to Queensberry Street here in Back Bay, Boston, and they would be singing and playing the Armenian songs. That's where Hovhaness got so much of Armenian.
Yes.
And vanity, because Yenofter Hakokian was vanity, my brother was vanity, and the songs were Yenofter Hakokian was an excellent singer of Sayat Nova.
Yes.
And then, of course, he sang the vanity songs.
Yes.
It was a wonderful occasion, at which occasionally I went. And this started here in Boston back in the 1940 years.
But actually, those are the only, I shouldn't say only, very few of the original folk material that Hovhaness has used in his compositions. If he has composed melodies that are similar to Armenian folk songs, they are simply inspired by the original Armenian folk songs.
By the way, I have records of Yenofter songs.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask, aside from his session at Berkshire Music,
yes.
were there other occasions in which he had to get together in a professional way with either a circle of students, composition students, or in other words, has he discussed his sources and his aims with his peers in any professional situation?
Not really, because the experience in Berkshire was a very negative one for Hovhaness, because he was ridiculed, particularly by Lucas Foss, Aaron Copland, and Lenny Bernstein. At best, he was considered an oddball, and at worst, he was just a charlatan who didn't know what to do, and he was trying to make headlines, and he had absolutely nothing to offer. So Alan is still, up to now, is very hurt from his treatment that he has done in the so-called establishment. And he shuns away all that, and he has created his own world and tries to live in that.
Another question. How often is his music performed in the United States?
He is one of the most frequently performed composers because he makes a point of writing music that is accessible. What is called in German, I think, Gebrauchsmusik, household music. Therefore, because it is both easily understandable and easily performable, many school orchestras, high school orchestras, utilize them by making presentations of his music. And it is through that he is able to make a good living through his compositions. Yes?
Last I heard, he was with the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. Do you know where he is now?
He lives in Renton, Washington at this point.
Still in Washington?
Yes, in Renton, yes. He is married to a Japanese, this is his sixth wife actually, and he travels, you know, very occasionally. He used to live in Switzerland, in Geneva for a long time, and then he was in New York for a while, and about 5-6 years ago he moved to Seattle, and he is there at this point. Yes?
You spoke of one Hovhaness composition, at least, that where the soloist was free to proceed at his own rate, at his own pace, against the other members playing. Is this similar to what Charles Ives, who we consider to be a very American composer, does with some of his music, or is this an entirely different kind of music?
It is entirely different because it is not in this case the soloist who is improvising or what we call aleatory music. It is the members of the orchestra who are playing different things. Each one of them is playing a different specified pattern at different times. And they are creating a kind of murmur in the ear, especially in this 1940-1950 period. And Hovhaness actually uses the same technique in 1960 and on, when he uses this particular aleatory procedure to create incredible climaxes, orchestral climaxes, and the focus becomes something quite different. It is not anymore a background. With this particular procedure used in the 40s, the aleatory
to what extent was this destroyed in the definition?
He has burned them, yes. A great many of them are burned. As I said, you know, there are 3 or 4 left. The best known is Aurore, as I said, for violin and piano. There are a couple of other pieces. There are no other piano pieces that I know of. He was called at the time the Armenian Sibelius, and he had had some correspondence with Sibelius, and he was likened to Sibelius. And after the 1942 incident at Tanglewood, he got so upset about the whole thing that he destroyed, and at that time actually he met a Greek mystic in Boston who told him that it was very important for him to go and search his roots. And he was already interested in Armenian music and background because of his father's culture. And that Greek mystic provided the initiative for him to go ahead and really immerse himself into the Armenian music and totally destroy what he had done before, because he considered that superficial.
There was a young lady here.
Contemporary music has been moving away to some extent from the very academic, inaccessible towards more melodic music. Do you think that Hovhaness has any influence on that new group of composers?
I don't think he has an influence. Well, perhaps he does to a point, but the establishment still is very much cerebral. As I said before, Hovhaness is not considered an establishment composer. He even had a great deal of difficulty being accepted to the Academy and Institute of Art and Letters in the States. Many established composers and artists and painters were very much against Hovhaness, because Hovhaness did not represent what the cultured musician composer had to do. Perhaps Hovhaness has really been a futurist composer man, because if you speak with him, if you talk to him, he's really a visionary in many ways, and perhaps because he feels that what he does now is valid for tomorrow, and he feels that whatever is being done by other composers today is only a passing trend. He actually likens what goes on, let's say, by Copland or Carter or whatever it is. He says those are like collisions of automobiles. It's like you put those horrible pieces in a museum and you say this is art. This is the kind of art that these people are writing. I don't want to have any part of that. I want to have music that belongs to all centuries, to all times. Perhaps we are coming back to him, to Hovhaness, but I think he is the steady force. He is not fluctuating. He is there, and if we come closer to him, then yes, perhaps he envisioned what was going to happen. But I don't think that's his doctrine. That's not a dogma with him. He's doing what he feels he should be doing as a musician, as an artist.
That was the question. It was answered.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You might be interested that he did, his composition was played at the Boston Symphony.
Yes.
And the prominent critics of the time, who were Cyrus Durgan and I believe Rudolph Ellie, praised his work very highly.
At this point, yes, because he is a member of the establishment in a way, because establishment has accepted Hovhaness. He's a member of the Institute and Academy of Arts and Letters. But still, he would do things that would be frowned upon, and they will say, well, that's Hovhaness. We don't take him seriously. He's not taken seriously, unfortunately, by many. There might be occasional critics who might understand what he's trying to do. But at large, if you go to any symposium or conference or whatever it is, of establishment composers, he will not be looked upon with great favor. Yes?
Does he have good success in the other Eastern countries?
A great deal, yes. Because he got 2 or 3 Fulbright scholarships or fellowships, and he went to India for a while. He was there, and most of those Eastern compositions were premiered over there. And actually in Japan and in China, especially in Japan, he is regarded as a god. He is the one who has understood the real music, which Japanese consider to be the Eastern music, of course, and somebody who has been able to delve into the depths of Eastern music and able to express it in a way that is understandable to the 20th century man. He is the composer number 1 as far as the East is concerned. Yes?
Sorry, one of the periodicals of the company that provides licensing rights for performing the music.
Yes.
Just about 6-7 years ago, he was the 3rd most frequently performed composer in the world.
Right.
And he was one of the very few who made full-time living out of just the royalty and license rights. And this was from the company that actually collects the license performance rights.
Well, that's not true, because he does make a very decent living just for his compositions. I mean, he doesn't teach.
That's what he said. That's what he just
said. Oh, yeah, that's what you said. Yes.
The company that collects the licensing fees said that their publication had for that particular year, he was the 3rd most frequently performed composer in the world.
And probably he is the most prolific composer living today. I think Mozart is the most prolific, and after that there is Mio, and Hovhaness is, I think, the most. I think his works are in the 350s or something like that. After he has destroyed all the ones before 1940. Yes.
His 52nd symphony is being performed this month in San Jose, California.
I'm sure, yes.
I just would like to point out one other thing. Mr. Hovhaness has been a friend of mine since 1945, and although it's true that other composers may not feel very warmly about his music because it's so different from their own, and he certainly does write very uniquely in his own personal style. Nonetheless, many other artists, other composers, conductors, painters were very much interested in his music. And Maro and Anahita Ajemian were 2 artists who were among the earliest to play his music and to make his music well known. And they were part of a committee of which I also was part of. In New York City at Carnegie Hall, and they made sure that the critics of that time in New York, Virgil Thomson,
especially Virgil Thomson, because he understood what was going on, and also John Cage was behind him.
Olin Downs was there too. They wrote unbelievably wonderful reviews.
Yes, they were very enthusiastic because at that time, you see, there was a reawakening towards the Eastern. There was an interest in what was going on. So Hovhaness at the time, in the 40s, it's true, he was in vogue.
Yeah.
But then, he became a little bit more interested in the Indian and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Korean. He did not follow, what was supposed to be the path towards the future. And, that unfortunately made him not unpopular, but he was just looked upon as
The
somebody.
opposite is true. When
Yeah.
some of the other composers give concerts, they're not terribly well attended.
That's right.
But almost every Hovhaness concert
Yes,
is very well
because it's
attended.
very easily likable and it's very easily performed and very easily understandable.
Yeah.
But that's one of his failures as far as the outside the so-called establishment world is concerned. I mean, the music, the art is supposed to be difficult. If you listen to something, if you can understand it right away, there's something very wrong with that.
There was a question.
Sure. Yes.
Based on your statement of definition of Eastern and Western music,
Yeah.
how much of Gomidas is Eastern, how much of it is Western?
Well, Gomidas is 100% Armenian.
I'm talking about music.
Gomidas' music is 100% Armenian. Yes.
Just since we mentioned Anahit and
Yes,
Maro,
of course.
they came here to Boston to
Yes.
give a concert at the Jordan Hall.
Right.
And they wanted to see Alan Hovhaness, and I drove them to Alan Hovhaness' place, which was near the Museum of Fine Art.
Right.
And all he had in this big studio was a Franklin stove
Yes.
and his piano.
Yes.
And circumstances at that time were very difficult for him.
Yeah. It was because, unfortunately, the Armenians, before the 45 affair, the concert, did not look upon him with great favors. I mean, he desperately wanted to have a tape recorder because there were all kinds of melodies floating around, Armenian melodies. He wanted to collect them to be able to study and this and that. And Armenians didn't pay any attention to him because he was not important enough, and they didn't give him, the couple of $100, whatever it was, that he needed to buy a tape recorder so he could collect those folk songs. He was not really paid attention to until, he made a name for himself in mid-40s. I think I should be getting okay?
There was one question. Sure. There's one question at the back. Somebody who hasn't asked the question yet.
Hovhaness's experience with the establishment
Yes.
in his development period, how accessible is he to modern struggling composers that are Armenian of our world? Is he reachable as Punjabi?
I mean, his music is very accessible.
No, he
He himself,
himself.
well, I tried to call him yesterday. His telephone suddenly has become unlisted.
Thank you. I would like to thank you very much indeed for a very stimulating remark. Our second speaker this afternoon is Dickran Kouymjian, a man of wide accomplishments. His PhD was from Columbia University in the field of Caucasian numismatics, if I remember correctly. Since then, he's worked in the field of Armenian art, but has also written quite extensively on medieval history and modern Armenian affairs. He's taught in Cairo, Beirut, and Paris, and now heads the Armenian Studies program at Fresno. There he knew William Saroyan and has recently been involved in the study and collection of all of Saroyan's unpublished works. I'm happy to welcome Dickran this afternoon because I first met him at a previous NAASR conference that was back in 1964, and our paths have often crossed since. Professor Kouymjian will speak on William Saroyan and the Armenian ethnic experience in America.
Hovhaness was a close friend of St. John Perse, and if you ever go to Aix-en-Provence, you will see an autographed copy of one of his symphonies in the St. John Perse Museum in Aix. And 3 years ago, at the Cabrillo Festival in California, an annual festival devoted more or less to contemporary music, Alan Hovhaness was the featured person, and for 1 week he was in Cabrillo, which is on the coast, not far from Santa Cruz, I believe. I have never been there. And that festival is recorded and to some extent very much patronized by Charles Amirkanyan, who is the longtime music director of the Pacifica Radio KPFA in San Francisco and one of the moguls of super contemporary Armenian music. The fact that that festival dealt with Hovhaness and his experience is perhaps indicative of a change. I'm going to speak about William Saroyan today, and I am not going to tell you a great deal about his life. I just assume you know enough about that for me to talk to you about what I want to talk to you about. And therefore, do not expect a lot of details. And I've entitled it William Saroyan and the Armenian Ethnic Experience in America. It is both curious and in some ways remarkable that the three first-generation Armenian Americans who are the subject of this panel gained national and international fame in three major branches of the arts. All brought something innovatively new and excitingly fresh to their respective disciplines. Alan Hovhaness in music, Saroyan in literature, Gorky in art. All were born in the Armenian world as it was before the full trauma of the genocide. Gorky in Van in 1904, he died in 1948 in America. William Saroyan in Fresno in 1908, but spiritually in Bitlis, where his two sisters were born. He was the only child born in America. And Alan Hovhaness, as you heard, in Somerville, Mass. in 1911. In so many ways, these three are similar. They were or are extraordinarily prolific, highly energized artists, pouring out works at times in almost uncontrollable bursts. They were or are always full of ideas, engaged in dozens of projects, and able to adapt different styles and modes within their chosen medium, and often in other media too. Their success was exhibited and nurtured in the America beyond the Armenian ghetto, though they were inspired by their distinctively Armenian ethnicity. All lived or live at a certain distance from the Armenian American community. All are married to non-Armenians. None of them owe their success to Armenian patronage, though too, Saroyan and Hovhaness were more closely associated with Armenian institutions in the early years of their careers. All feel or felt strongly Armenian and asserted their ethnic identity. That there were also differences among them is normal, and I shall leave those differences for others to enumerate. In the papers to be presented today, it should not come as a surprise nor a coincidence to hear three scholars provide strikingly similar analyses in content and form of the works of three Armenian artists who had little contact with each other. In a sense, I am that many of the faces and many of the people who spoke and made comments during the past 2 or 3 days on the question of identity are not here, and for that matter, I'm sorry that many of you were not present the first night and yesterday, because there has been so much discussed on the question of identity, and my paper is going to, in a sense, really talk about that question, and not provide all the answers that Thomson asked questions of at the beginning. Identity never presented a problem to William Saroyan. He asserted his openly and often. He was Armenian. He was American. For him, there was never any contradiction. Never did being one diminish being the other. Just as he was perfectly or imperfectly son or father, so he was perfectly or imperfectly Armenian or American and American. However, though he never had problems with identity, he devoted a considerable amount of his creative expression to an analysis and discussion of his own identities. As a writer, and more particularly, though it is as yet not very well known, a philosophical writer, Saroyan was much preoccupied with humanistic, moral, existential, and metaphysical questions. In the final 20 years of his life, his serious work was writing about every man's passage through life. This work, derived from Saroyan's incessant research, based almost exclusively on observation, and supplemented by ceaseless and voracious random reading. Though much of his voluminous production, most of it still unpublished, during the last decade was autobiographical, it should be noted that along with works like Obituaries and the Posthumous Births, his last two published memoirs, there were also the purely literary, non-autobiographical ones, such as his last published plays of 1979 with the title Assassinations. It had nothing to do with Armenian assassination. In terms of this conference, if Saroyan's identity by speech and manners was perfectly American, he never assimilated. Indeed, he would have argued that Armenians or members of other ethnic minorities should not assimilate, but rather integrate. Saroyan felt well integrated in American life. After all, he is known not as an Armenian writer, but as a Pulitzer Prize-winning American one who captured Middle America and its idiom as well as any writer of the 1930s and 40s. It is strange how in America we as Armenians still are trapped by the word assimilation, arguing its merits or demerits for the Armenian. European Armenians, it seems to me, understood much earlier than their American counterparts that successful integration into the new society was essential and useful, whereas assimilation was suspect. As part of William Saroyan's quest to understand his own identity, it is only natural that the Armenian component of it be important and therefore observed, studied, pondered, and ultimately engaged. In his life, an interesting biographical pattern emerged. The first 18 years, more or less, spent in the Armenian environment of Fresno, California. The next 36 years at large in the roughly non-Armenian world, and the final 18 years back in the Armenian worlds of Fresno, Paris, and even Yerevan, kind of like a sonata form, ABA, since we had the music. The last 18 years were an acknowledged return to the sources of much of his earlier creative production. One need not make too much out of this pattern. But it is true that in the middle period, contacts were almost exclusively for him with the world of American theater and letters, while in the last years, most of his intimates in Paris and Fresno were Armenian. But today, we need to concentrate on the Armenian content of Saroyan's experience as an American, especially as he himself understood it and argued it in his own writing. In presenting the following material on Saroyan's Armenian side, it is important to remember that it is based on only a portion of his writing on the subject. The bulk of his published corpus, a sampling of unpublished material, with his as yet unknown art, if I have a chance to show you some slides after the break, and familiarity, my familiarity, with his private environments, his houses in Fresno and his apartment in Paris. However, this analysis is ignorant of, that is my analysis, is ignorant of and does not take into consideration his most intimate thoughts as recorded in personal journals over 50 years, or his personal letters, most of which remain, the bulk of which remain unpublished, and a large number of unpublished novels and plays. The consciously Armenian Saroyan is found regularly within his short stories and essays, especially the earlier ones, and his autobiographical memoirs, 10 volumes published from 1951 to 1982. Except for his first major play, My Heart's in the Highlands, which features an Armenian poet, none of the more than 50 plays which have been published since have an Armenian character or an Armenian theme. Of his 9 published novels, all heavily autobiographical. Only Vagram of 1951 and The Laughing Matter of 1963 have protagonists emphatically identified as Armenian. Nevertheless, already the early short stories pose questions about being Armenian, about the dilemmas of being a part of an exiled nation with such a precise and dramatically inescapable recent history. In these stories, emphasis is on the individual, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm of the world. They anticipate the full-blown existential treatment of the same problems in his latter works. Furthermore, each significant reference to the ethnicity of an Armenian in these stories is almost always and immediately followed by the statement that being Armenian is nothing more than being any other ethnic because they all share the same humanity. This paradoxical method Saroyan was so fond of was never used, however, to suggest that being Armenian was unimportant for those who are in fact Armenians. This theme is much developed in later works. It is not possible to list all of the stories in which this theme of the Armenian in America is central. For the most part, these stories are in works written, that is, collections of stories, before his theatrical successes of 1939 to 1942. In the poignant tale, 70,000 Assyrians of 1935, the narrator, presumably Saroyan himself, in a barber shop, in asking the barber Theodore Badal whether he, the barber, is Armenian, Saroyan says, just after he asks the question without waiting for the answer, I am an Armenian. People look at me and begin to wonder, so I come right out and tell them, I am an Armenian. It is a meaningless remark, but they expect me to say it, so I do. I have no idea what it is like to be an Armenian, or what it is like to be an Englishman or a Japanese or anything else. I have a faint idea what it is like to be alive. This is the only thing that interests me greatly. This and tennis. Badal, the barber, as it turns out, is an Assyrian. He briefly outlines the former grandeur of his nation, to which Saroyan replies, we are hopeful, that is, we Armenians, there is no Armenian living who does not still dream of an independent Armenian. Dream, said Badal? Well, that's something. Assyrians cannot even dream anymore. Why, do you know how many of us there are left on the earth? 2 or 3 million, Saroyan suggested. 70,000, said Badal, will be wiped out before long. My brother is married to an American girl, and he has a son. There is no more hope. We are trying to forget Assyria. The rest of the story is pointless, Saroyan says in this story, but continues, quote, this work, that is his work of portraying people like Badal, he tells us in the story, this work is a tribute to Iowa, to Japan, other things mentioned in the story, to Assyria, to Armenia, to the race of man everywhere, to the dignity of that race, to the brotherhood of things alive. I am thinking of 70,000 Assyrians, one at a time, alive, a great race. I am thinking of Theodore Badal, himself 70,000 Assyrians, and 70 million Assyrians, himself Assyria and man, standing in a barber shop in San Francisco in 1933 and being himself the whole race. End of quote. It is clear from this early passage that for Saroyan, the individual, each individual bears within her himself the salvation of the group. He strove to impress on his readers that the self-assertion of identity was the way to protect the ethnic group. In another story of the period, Antranik of Armenia, Saroyan uses the famous hero to explore the dilemma presented by a valiant fighter who embodies the struggle for dignity and independence against the Turk, but who also embodies, more pathetically, the genocide and the loss of most of Armenia's land to the Turk and of her independence to the Russians. Antranik came to Fresno, a defeated and superfluous general, to wither helplessly to death. Saroyan's grasp of Armenian political reality in this story, his method of articulating the contradictions, are as insightful and well understood as pages in any professional history book written on this period, 1920 to 1927. I quote from the story: "And I with my uncle," his uncle Aram, who's still alive in his 90s, "I and my uncle Aram jumped up." Antranik pays a visit to his uncle Aram's office. His uncle Aram was a lawyer. "I with my uncle jump up, loving him the same way." Sorry, I've read that badly, but I'll start. "I with my uncle jumped up, loving him the same way. Antranik, the great man fallen to nothing, the soldier helpless in a world now full of cheap and false peace. He himself betrayed, and his people betrayed. In Armenia, only a memory. The governments of strong nations betrayed Antranik and Armenia after the war, but the soldiers of Armenia refused to betray themselves. Somehow or other, the whole people was not annihilated. They were cold and hungry and ill, but these soldiers won their war, and Armenia was a nation with a government and a political party." And he continues, "I know how silly it is to be proud, but I cannot help it. I am proud. Way out in California, I sat in my uncle's office. To hell with it, I said. It's all over. We can begin to forget Armenia now. Antranik is dead." Obviously, the story is continued. "The nation is lost. The strong nations of the world are jumping with new problems. To hell with it. I'm no Armenian. I'm an American." "Well, the truth is, I am both and neither. I love Armenia. I love America. I belong to both. But I am only this, an inhabitant of the earth. And so are you, whoever you are." Saroyan continues in the story. "I tried to forget Armenia, but I couldn't do it. My birthplace was California, but I couldn't forget Armenia." And then at the very end of the story, Saroyan talks about his trip to Soviet Armenia, which he made in 1935 after his very first success. He likens Armenia to the San Joaquin Valley there, and he likens the inhabitants that he saw in 1935 in Armenia with the Armenians that he knew in Fresno. At the very end of the story, as a final statement, pathetically, powerfully, he says, "And the sadness of Armenia, my country, was so great in me," when he was in Yerevan, "that the only thing I could remember about Armenia was the quiet way General Antranik talked with my uncle many years ago, and the tears in my uncle's eyes when he was gone, and the painful way my uncle's lips were trembling." Saroyan was always to keep the memory and the symbol of Antranik very close to him. During his long residence in Paris, he would regularly go to visit Antranik's tomb and memorial in the cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris, one of the most famous cemeteries. And whenever he went, he was always very careful to either pick a flower or some pebbles off the grave and bring them home to his apartment where he kept them very carefully amongst his most treasured memorabilia. And he never really missed a chance to be photographed next to Andronics's grave. I'll be able to show you one later. Only one more short piece from this early period will be quoted by me, simply because it has become famous in Armenian circles of late. It is from the story The Armenian and the Armenian, in which Saroyan meets a countryman in the city of Rostov during his famous trip to the Soviet Union in 1935. It ends with that very famous passage, and I quote, "I should like to see any power of the world destroy this race, this small tribe of unimportant people whose history is ended, whose wars have all been fought and lost, whose structures have crumbled, whose literature is unread, whose music is unheard, whose prayers are no longer uttered. Go ahead, destroy this race. Let us say that it is again 1915. There is war in the world. Destroy Armenia. See if you can do it. Send them from their homes into the desert. Let them have neither bread nor water. Burn their houses and their churches. See if the race will not live again when two of them meet in a beer parlor 20 years later and laugh and speak their tongue. Go ahead. See if you can do anything about it. See if you can stop them from mocking the big ideas of the world, you sons of bitches. A couple of Armenians talking in the world. Go ahead and try to destroy them." To imagine that all of Saroyan's writing on his ethnic identity was of the same quality would be as naive as the prevailing opinion among some professors of English and literary authorities who dismiss his work as sentimental, a judgment based on the shallow reading of a few of his most popular works. Saroyan, for instance, in such stories as "Countrymen, How Do You Like America?" and the other story, "Warm, Quiet Valley of Home," clearly contrasts the older Armenian generation with the new integrated generation. This material, this particular and very, very interesting contrast, has now been rather nicely synthesized by David Stephen Calonne in chapter 3 entitled "Exile in America" of his most sensitive book recently published, William Saroyan, My Real Work is Being, North Carolina University Press, available from NAASR. So I will not discuss that farther, except for one story. This process of integration is clearly articulated in Saroyan's most famous of all collections of stories, My Name is Aram, of 1940, especially in stories like The Orator, the one about the pomegranate trees, the one called Poor and Burning Arab, of Kouymjian, he obviously translated that, and Locomotive 38, The Ojib Way. In that latter story, Locomotive 38, The Ojib Way, the young Aram boldly asserts to a newly made friend, an Indian, boldly asserts, "I'm no American." And the Indian replies, "I know," the Indian said, "you're an Armenian. I remember you told me. You're an Armenian born in America. You're 14 years old, and you already know you'll be able to drive an automobile the minute you get into one. You're a typical American, although your complexion, like my own, is dark." The irony here is, of course, double. Aram thinks he's not American. He, like Saroyan, struggles by this denial to be true to his roots, afraid of betraying his Armenian origins. But more painfully, the only true American, the Indian, feels so estranged that he doesn't even pose the question of fitting into the mainstream of America. Saroyan picks up the Indian theme many times, by the way. But was there ever any doubt in recognizing William Saroyan as a great ethnic writer? I don't think so. He may easily have written more about different national groups and ethnicity than any other writer in America before or after him. In this picture of Saroyan's early ethnic identity, His relationship with the Hierarchic Association of Boston and its publications is fundamental. It shows the depth of his Armenian commitment. It is probably true that his early start as a writer was in part due to the poems and stories published under his name and under the pseudonym Sirak Goryan. And these were printed in the pages of the Hierarchic Daily and Weekly in 1933 and 1934. James Takooshian, in collecting the 104 surviving letters that Saroyan wrote to the editors of the Hierarchics from 1934 to 1978, has provided us with an eloquent witness to the deep affinity Saroyan felt toward Armenian letters and toward Armenian ethnic survival. These letters represent the only published corpus of Saroyan correspondence. That special Saroyan memorial issue of the Armenian Review contains a comprehensive introduction by Takooshian, which insists that the letters show that Saroyan is best understood as an Armenian writer, who, though born in America, is firmly rooted in his native tradition. This position is later elaborated by James Takooshian in the introduction to his recent book, My Name is William Saroyan, an anthology of more than 100 Saroyan items published over the years in the Hierarchics themselves. Takooshian additionally points out what I have also observed, namely that the extent of Mr. Saroyan's information on the Armenians was beyond imagination. He knew everything relating to the Armenians, not only as